The morning Silas Rourke rode up to Marin Holloway's fence and told her that her dead husband's debt was now her problem. That was the morning everything changed. He didn't dismount. He didn't take off his hat. He just sat there on that big chestnut horse looking down at her like she was something the drought had left behind. And he said, "I want my money by the end of the month, or I'll take the land." Her baby was on her hip. Her daughter was standing right there, and Marin said nothing. Because what do you say to a man like that? If that had happened to you, if that had been your door, your children, your land, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, if you believe kindness still matters in a hard world, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next, because what Gideon Ashcroft did on that third morning, it will stay with you. The first time Gideon Ashcroft saw her, he almost didn't stop. I was coming back from the south pasture on a Tuesday, saddle sore and half thinking about whether the creek had dropped another inch overnight, when he spotted the figure on the ridge road. A woman. 2 buckets hanging from a wooden yoke across her shoulders. Something wrapped and strapped against her chest. A baby, he realized after a second look. And a small child walking beside her, maybe 5 years old, holding the hem of the woman's skirt with one hand like she was afraid of being left behind. Gideon pulled his horse to a stop. It wasn't the buckets that stopped him. You saw people hauling water out here. That was frontier life. What stopped him was the way she was walking, not defeated, not dragging. She was walking like someone who had made a private agreement with the road, like she had decided the road was going to lose, and she was just waiting for it to figure that out. He watched until she crested the hill and disappeared. Then he rode home and didn't say anything about it to anyone. That night, eating alone at a table built for 2, Gideon looked out the kitchen window at the darkness and thought about her shoulders. How square they were. How she hadn't once shifted the yoke to ease the weight, the way most people did when they thought nobody was looking. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that a lot. Gideon was 61 years old and had lived on the Ashcroft Ranch for 37 of those years. He had buried a wife, survived 2 droughts that were supposed to wipe him out, and learned the hard way that the frontier didn't care how much you'd already given, it would ask for more. He kept 3 ranch hands on, ran about 200 head of cattle, and owned more land than he needed and less peace than he wanted. His neighbors knew him as a fair man. Not warm, exactly. Fair. He paid what he owed. He didn't steal water rights. He didn't run his fences onto other people's ground. Out here, that was nearly enough to make you a good man. Nearly. His wife, Clara, had died 6 years earlier. Pneumonia, which felt like a cruel joke for a woman who'd spent 20 years worrying about drought. She'd been 49 years old. She had never, not once, complained about hauling water from the creek to the house, back in the early years before Gideon had finally gotten around to having a proper well dug. He'd always meant to do it sooner. He just hadn't. There was always something. Cattle prices, a busted fence line, a sick calf, an argument with a neighbor over grazing land. Something. Clara had never asked him to hurry. That was the thing that still kept him up some nights. She never once said, "Gideon, I'm tired of this walk." She just kept making it. He'd had the well dug 8 months after she died. He'd stood beside it on the day it was finished and felt something in his chest that he still didn't have a name for. So no. The woman on the ridge road was not his business. He told himself that again on Wednesday morning, when he saw her making the same walk at the same hour, the same buckets, the same child. He told himself that again. Wednesday evening, when he saw her walking back, the buckets full now, her gait slower but no less determined, the child now on her back, because the little girl's legs had given out somewhere along the 4 miles between the Tanner Spring and the Holloway homestead. He stood at his fence and watched her pass and said nothing. She didn't look at him. Well, her name was Marin Holloway. He found that out from Pete Duggan at the feed store on Thursday morning, because after 2 days of watching and saying nothing, Gideon had started asking. Pete knew everybody. It was his gift and his curse. Holloway widow, Pete said, without looking up from the sack he was tying. Husband died about 8 months back. Fever. Left her with the 2 kids, the little girl and the baby, and about 40 acres of decent enough land if you could work it properly. She's trying. Where's she getting her water? Pete finally looked up. Tanner Spring, same one everybody used before Silas Rourke bought up the surrounding property. Now she's got to walk out around the long way because Rourke put his fence right across the shortcut, adds about 2 miles to the trip. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Why doesn't someone... She won't take help. Pete said it plainly, no judgment in it, just fact. A couple of the women tried bringing water to her place. She sent them home. Reverend Chambers offered to organize a collection. She told him she appreciated the thought and to please not. Pete shrugged one shoulder. She's proud. Not stupid proud. Just proud. Gideon paid for his feed and drove home. That afternoon, he walked the boundary of his own property, something he hadn't done in a while, tracing the fence line along the south edge, where his land came closest to the Holloway place. He was thinking, not planning, not yet, just thinking, about where a well might go if a person were going to dig one on 40 acres of frontier land, where the water table might be, whether the rock under there ran the same direction as the rock under his land, which had given up water at about 60 feet if he remembered right. I was still telling himself it wasn't his business, but his feet were taking him to the property line anyway. What? Friday morning, Gideon was up before the sun. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he didn't go to the pasture. He went to the ridge road and sat on the fence rail with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand, and he waited. She came at first light. He had been trying to decide on the walk over whether he was going to say something to her. He had a version worked out, something neighborly, not pushy, just an opening to a conversation that might lead naturally to an offer that she might naturally be willing to hear. He lost the whole speech the moment he saw her face. She was young. He'd known that, roughly, from a distance. But up close, she looked younger than he'd expected, and also older. 28, Pete had said. She had the kind of face that had started out soft and was being made harder by the life she was living, and the combination of those two things, what she had been, what she was becoming, hit him somewhere behind the sternum. She noticed him on the fence rail and slowed slightly. Didn't stop. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She kept walking. The baby on her chest was asleep. The little girl looked up at him with serious dark eyes and then looked away, deciding he wasn't interesting. "I'm Gideon Ashcroft," he said to her back. She turned her head without stopping. "I know who you are. I thought..." He stopped. What had he thought? He didn't know. "I thought maybe you'd like some water," he said, which was not what he'd planned to say, and which was, as soon as he heard himself say it, a stupid thing to say to a woman who was currently walking to get water. She did stop then, turned around and looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite irritation, something between the two. "I'm getting some," she said, flat. Not mean, just a statement of fact. "I know," Gideon said. "I just meant my creek." He stopped again. She was looking at him the way people look at someone who is clearly about to put his foot in his mouth, and the kindness in that look, the patience of it, made him feel like he was 90 years old. "I could dig you a well," he said. The patience left her face. "No, thank you," she said, and turned back to the road. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Ashcroft," she said it without turning around. "I don't need a well I didn't earn. I have 2 legs, and I have 2 buckets, and I have a spring that's 2 miles away. That's enough." She walked. He watched her go. The little girl glanced back at him once, solemn as a judge, and then looked forward again. Gideon got down off the fence rail and stood in the road for a minute, holding his cold coffee. He hadn't been turned down like that since he was about 19 years old, and he hadn't deserved the yes that time either. He went home. He fed the cattle. He mended a section of fence that had been annoying him for 2 weeks. He ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table still felt, after 6 years, like an accusation. He did not think about Maren Holloway. He thought about her constantly. He was careful about this, in the privacy of his own mind. It wasn't what people might think it was. He wasn't some lonely old widower manufacturing a reason to go talk to a young woman. He was clear-eyed enough, he hoped, to know the difference between loneliness and conscience. And his conscience was what was keeping him up. He kept seeing Clara. Not her face, exactly. Her back. The specific shape of her back as she walked from the creek to the house. The way she tilted slightly left to compensate for the weight of the buckets. He hadn't noticed that tilt when she was alive. He'd noticed it in the weeks after she died, when he'd stood at the kitchen window looking at the creek and realized he'd been watching her make that walk for 20 years without once really seeing her make it. He'd told himself it was a different time. that they couldn't afford it those first years, that by the time they could, she had the rhythm of it, the routine, and he hadn't wanted to disrupt what was working. He told himself a lot of things. Saturday morning, Gideon made himself stay home. He managed until about 9 o'clock. Then he saddled his horse and rode out to the ridge road, not to intercept her. He wasn't going to do that again. Just to, he told himself, check the fence line along there. It needed doing. It always needed doing. He was checking the third fence post when he heard the child's voice. "Mama, the bucket's leaking." Gideon turned. About 50 yards down the road, Marin had set the buckets down and was crouching over one of them, her hands cupped under the bottom seam where a crack had opened up. Water was seeping out in a thin, steady stream. Not a flood, but steady. Enough to matter on a 4-mile walk. The little girl was watching with the particular expression children get when they understand that something is wrong and they're trying very hard not to make it worse by asking about it. Marin put her thumb over the crack, held it there, thinking. Then she stood up, lifted the yoke back onto her shoulders, and started walking. She was pressing the side of her knee against the leaking bucket as she moved, trying to slow the seam with the pressure. It was a terrible solution. It was also the only solution she had, and she was doing it without hesitation, without complaint, without even a sound. Gideon stood at his fence post and felt something give way inside him. Not dramatically, not like a flood, like a fence post finally pulling free of dry ground, just a small giving way, and then the gap was there. He did not go over to her. He had tried offering help. She had been clear. He was not going to be the kind of man who couldn't hear a clear answer. But he rode home and pulled out paper and wrote down what he needed. Workers, equipment, a dowser, someone who knew how to find water, though he was skeptical of the mystical end of it and more interested in the practical. His own experience with the land. The geological survey he'd had done on the north section 10 years ago. He wasn't planning anything. He was just thinking on paper. He left the paper on the table and went to bed. Sunday. He didn't see her in the morning. He'd been delayed by a sick calf in the east pen. Not serious, but something that needed watching. And by the time he was free, the road was empty. He told himself that was fine. At about 3 in the afternoon, one of his hands, a lean, quiet young man named Dalton, came up to him by the water trough and said, "Boss, you want to see something?" Gideon followed him to the south fence line. From there, with the land dropping slightly, you could see down into the lower field between his property and the Rourke spread. Marin was there. She had stopped, or been stopped, Gideon couldn't tell which, and she was crouching by the fence that Silas Rourke had built across the old shortcut. There was a calf on the other side. Young, brown, very still. Its legs were folded under it wrong, and even at this distance Gideon could tell it was in distress. Marin set down her buckets. She looked at the calf. She looked at her buckets. She looked at her baby, who was awake now and making small, restless sounds against her chest. She looked at her daughter, who had stopped walking and was watching her mother with that serious judge face. Then Marin picked up one of the buckets, the full one, the one that hadn't been leaking, and she began to pour water through the fence rails over the calf. Dalton said something under his breath. Gideon couldn't hear it exactly. He thought it might have been, "Oh, come on now." He knew what Dalton meant. She'd walked 2 miles to get that water. Her baby needed it. She was pouring it into the dust on the wrong side of a fence that belonged to a man who had never given her anything. She kept pouring until the calf moved, until its head came up, until it made a sound. Then she straightened up, picked up the bucket, empty now, nearly, and adjusted the yoke back onto her shoulders. Her daughter said, "Mama, why?" Marin started walking. "Because it was thirsty." That was all. She said it the way you say something that doesn't need explaining. The way you say the sky is blue or water runs downhill. Just a fact about the world. Gideon stood at his fence line and could not speak for a moment. Dalton said quietly, "She's something." "Yeah," Gideon said. He went back to the house. He picked up the paper he'd left on the table. The list, the notes, the not-quite plans. He sat down. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up a pencil and started turning the list into something more serious. He thought about Clara, about the well he'd meant to dig and hadn't, about all the mornings he'd watched her walk to the creek and told himself there would be time. He thought about a 5-year-old girl asking her mother why she'd given away their water, and a woman answering because it was thirsty. Like that was the only answer that made sense. Gideon was not a sentimental man. He had cried exactly twice in his adult life, once when Clara died, and once when he'd put down the horse he'd raised from a foal. He wasn't about to cry over a list of well-digging supplies, but his hand was not entirely steady when he wrote the first name down. He'd call on Roy Dempsey first thing Monday morning. Roy was 70 years old and ornery and had found water on 6 supposedly dry properties in this valley over his lifetime. He also hadn't spoken to Gideon in 2 years over a property dispute that Gideon was pretty sure was Roy's fault, and Roy was absolutely sure was Gideon's. Gideon wrote Roy's name down anyway. Then he wrote down the names of 2 workers he trusted, then the equipment he'd need, then a rough estimate of how deep they might have to go based on the survey and his own gut. He looked at the list for another minute. At the bottom, he wrote, "She won't want this." He underlined it. Then he wrote beneath that, "Figure out why she should take it anyway." He sat at that table until the sun was long gone and the kitchen was dark around him, and he worked on that problem the way he worked on every hard problem, stubbornly, quietly, and without any particular certainty that he was going to solve it. But he was going to try. Some debts, he had come to understand, don't get repaid to the person you owe them to. Sometimes the only thing you can do is find someone else who's owed the same thing, and try this time not to be too late. Monday morning was coming. He had a phone call to make to an ornery old man who probably wouldn't want to hear from him. He had a woman to convince who had already told him no. He had dry ground to put a hole in, and no guarantee that hole would find anything. It was, he thought, staring at his list in the dark, about the most uncertain thing he'd set out to do in years. He went to bed feeling, for the first time in longer than he could name, something close to purpose. He called Roy Dempsey at 6 in the morning, which was either the right time to call Roy or the worst possible time, and Gideon hadn't entirely decided which before he dialed. Roy picked up on the 3rd ring. "What?" Not a question, just the word, flat and suspicious, like he'd been expecting bad news and was bracing for it. "It's Gideon Ashcroft." Silence. Then, "I know who it is." I said what, not who. Gideon shifted the phone against his ear. Outside his kitchen window, the sky was still the color of old iron, that particular gray that came before the light actually committed to arriving. "I need your help finding water." "Your well's fine." "Not my well. Neighbor's property, the Holloway place, south side. 40 acres, used to belong to the Tanner family before they sold in, I think it was 89. Another silence. Roy was thinking. Gideon could almost hear it. "Holloway. That the widow?" "Yes." "She know you're calling me?" Gideon looked at his list on the table, at the line he'd underlined the night before. "She won't want this." "Not yet." Roy made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough. With Roy, it was sometimes hard to tell. "So you want me to come find water on land whose owner doesn't know you're planning to dig a hole in it?" "I want to know if there's water there before I have the conversation about digging the hole." "That's not how this works, Gideon." "I know how it works, Roy. I'm asking you to do it anyway." The silence this time was longer. Gideon waited it out. He was good at waiting. It was one of the few things about getting older that he'd actually come to appreciate. The ability to sit inside a silence without filling it up just because it made you uncomfortable. Roy said, "You still think I moved that fence post?" "I don't want to talk about the fence post." "That's because you know I didn't move it." "Roy, fine." The word came out like something being dropped. "Day after tomorrow. I'm not driving out there on empty stomach, so don't ask me before noon." Gideon said he wouldn't, and Roy hung up without saying goodbye, which was at least consistent. He'd never once said goodbye in the 22 years Gideon had known him. Gideon poured himself another cup of coffee and stood at the window and watched the sky turn from iron to the pale washed-out blue that passed for morning light in late August. He had one name on his list checked off. He had several more to go. And he had a conversation ahead of him that he was not looking forward to, with a woman who had already told him no once, and would probably do it again with less patience the second time. But he'd been told no before. It rarely turned out to be the end of anything. He didn't go to the Ridge Road Monday morning. He made himself stay away, for the very specific reason that showing up there 2 days in a row after she'd already turned him down would cross the line from neighborly into something that didn't have a polite name. Instead, he drove to town. Millhaven was not a large town. 3 blocks of storefronts, a feed store, a post office that was also the telegraph office, a doctor who came twice a week from the county seat, and enough churches for a population 3 times its size, which had always struck Gideon as a peculiar allocation of resources. The diner on the main street was called Patterson's, though no Patterson had owned it in 15 years. It was run now by a woman named Dottie Vance, who made the best pie in the valley and the worst coffee west of the Mississippi, and was fiercely proud of both. Gideon sat at the counter and ordered the coffee because he was in the habit of it, and within 4 minutes, Dottie had slid onto the stool next to him. There were no other customers, it was barely past 8, and said, "You look like a man who's been thinking too hard." "I always look like that." "Usually you look like a man who's thinking hard about something that already happened. Today you look like a man thinking about something that hasn't happened yet." She put her elbows on the counter and looked at him sideways. "Which means you're either planning something or you're trying to talk yourself out of planning something." Gideon drank his terrible coffee. "How well do you know the Holloway woman?" Dottie's expression shifted just slightly. Not toward suspicion, more toward care, which was a different thing. "Marin? I know her. She comes in when she can, which isn't often. Why?" "What do people think of her?" "People think she's too proud for her own good," Dottie said. "People think she should have gone back to her family in Sacramento when Thomas died. People think a lot of things about Marin Holloway that aren't any of their business." She paused. "What do you think of her?" Gideon turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "I think she's carrying something she shouldn't have to carry alone." Dottie was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "And you want to help?" "I want to dig a well on her property." Dottie looked at him for a long moment. "She'll say no." "She already did." "And you're going to try again." "I'm thinking about how." Dottie straightened up and picked up a dish towel and started wiping down the counter, which is what she did when she was thinking something through and didn't want to stop moving while she did it. "She's not proud the way people mean it," she said after a while. "She's not too big for her boots. It's more like—" She stopped, wiped, started again. "Thomas left some debts, not big ones. But she couldn't pay them and keep the land both, so she sold some things and paid the debts and kept the land. And then 3 separate people in this town, good people, Gideon, I'm not saying otherwise, tried to give her things. Food, money, labor. And every one of them made her feel, not on purpose, but still, like she was something to be pitied. Like she was one of those charity cases you tell your children about to make them feel grateful." Gideon said nothing. "She's not a charity case," Dottie said. "She's a woman who got handed a terrible year and is working her way through it. There's a difference. She just needs the people offering to understand that difference." She set down the dish towel and looked at him directly. "If you go back to her with a gift, she'll say no again. If you go back to her with a transaction, something she can say yes to without losing herself in it, that might be different." Gideon thought about what he'd written at the bottom of his list. Figure out why she should take it anyway. He thought maybe Dottie had just told him. He drove out to see Webb Coulter next, who was one of the 2 workers he'd had in mind, and who lived on a small property north of town and did contract labor for half the ranches in the county. Webb was 43, built like a barn door, and had the useful quality of never asking questions that weren't strictly necessary. Gideon liked that about him. He found Webb replacing boards on his back porch and laid out the situation plainly. Possible well dig, property south of the Ashcroft Ranch, dependent on whether Roy Dempsey confirmed water was there to be found. Webb listened without stopping work. "She know about it?" "Not yet." "Paying job?" "I'll pay your rate." Webb drove a nail home, tested the board with his boot, and said, "When you need me, let me know," which was all Gideon needed from him. He stopped by to see his second choice for labor, a younger man named Curtis Pratt, who was less experienced than Webb, but had helped dig 2 wells in the county and knew the equipment, and got a similar answer, conditional on timing. By noon he was back at the ranch, and by noon he was out of things to do that weren't the one thing he still had to do, which was figure out what he was going to say to Marin Holloway. He ate lunch. He fixed a gate hinge that had been squeaking. He walked the perimeter of his south pasture and tried out versions of the conversation in his head and discarded every one of them. The problem wasn't the argument. He had the argument. Dottie had handed him the shape of it. The problem was that arguments weren't what moved people. You could have the best argument in the world and lay it out like a legal brief, and the person on the other end of it would still find a reason to say no, because arguments were things the mind dealt with, and the mind was very good at building walls. What moved people was something else. Something truer. And the truest thing Gideon had in this situation was also the thing he least wanted to say out loud, because he hadn't said it out loud to anyone in 6 years, and saying it would require him to hand something over that he'd been holding tight to for exactly that long. He stood at the south fence line in the afternoon heat and looked out over the Holloway property. He could see the roof of the house from here, just the corner of it above the rise. And he thought about Clara, about her back, the tilt to the left, about the morning he'd stood beside a finished well and felt that thing he'd never named. He could name it now, he thought, if he was being honest. It was shame, not dramatic, operatic shame, just the quiet, settled weight of knowing you had let time pass on something that mattered and told yourself it was fine. And then the time had run out, and it was not fine, and there was nothing left to do about it. He couldn't undo that. He knew that, had always known it, but he'd been living with it the way you live with a stone in your boot, present and painful, and something you'd more or less decided to simply endure because taking the boot off and dealing with it seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Maybe it was time to take off the boot. He saw her Tuesday morning. He had positioned himself, and he was honest with himself about the fact that he had positioned himself near the south fence line at a time when he knew she'd be passing, not to intercept her, but because the alternative was going to her house unannounced, and he felt even more uncomfortable about that. She came down the ridge road at her usual pace, buckets on the yoke, baby asleep, daughter walking alongside with a stick. She'd found somewhere and was dragging along the fence rails to make a sound. Maren saw him, and her pace didn't change. She kept coming, and when she was close enough, she said, before he could say anything, "Mr. Ashcroft." "Mrs. Holloway." He took off his hat. He hadn't planned to do that. It just happened. "I was hoping to talk with you for a minute." "I haven't changed my answer." "I haven't asked my question yet." She stopped, looked at him. Her daughter stopped too, stick still against the fence rail, looking up at Gideon with those dark, serious eyes that always made him feel like he was being evaluated by someone who had considerably better judgment than him and was being polite about it. "My wife's name was Clara," Gideon said. Maren blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. He could see that. "She died 6 years ago. Before she died, for a long time, years, she walked from the creek to the house and back, carrying water. Every day. I always meant to dig a well. I always had a reason not to. A good reason, or something that felt like a good reason at the time." He looked at the fence post beside him, rather than at her. "She never asked me to hurry. That was the kind of woman she was. She just kept making the walk and never said a word about it." He paused. "I had the well dug 8 months after she died. I stood there when it was finished and He stopped. Maren was watching him, not with pity, with something more careful than pity. "I cannot give you back what Clara gave up," Gideon said. "I know that. I'm not confused about what this is. But I have been watching you make this walk for 5 days, and I have the means to end it. And if I drive past you one more morning and do nothing, then I am the same man I was with Clara, and I'm tired of being that man." He put his hat back on. "That's my question, whether you'd let me try to be a different one." He did not say it well. It came out rough and in the wrong order, and he'd left out half of what he'd meant to say. But it was true, which was more than he could say for the polished version he'd been working on in his head for 2 days. Maren was quiet for a long time. Her daughter tugged at her skirt. "Mama." "Hush, baby." Another silence. "I can't pay for a well," Maren said at last. "I'm not asking you to. I don't take charity. I know." He looked at her directly now. "This isn't charity. This is a debt that can't be repaid to the person it's owed to, so I'm paying it sideways. That's different." Something moved across her face, not quite softening, but a shift in the quality of the resistance, like the difference between a door that's locked and a door that's just being held shut. "You'd dig it on my land," she said. "Yes. Your workers, your equipment. And Roy Dempsey, if he'll come. He's the best water finder in the county. He'll confirm there's water there before we put a shovel in the ground. And if there isn't, then we don't dig. And I'll leave you alone." He paused. "I'll leave you alone either way, if you want. I mean that." She looked down at her daughter, who had abandoned the stick and was now crouching in the road examining something in the dust. A bug, probably, or a pebble. The serious investigation of small things that occupied much of her waking hours. "Lily," Maren said. The girl looked up. "What do you think?" Lily looked at Gideon with that evaluating expression. Then she looked at the buckets on her mother's yoke. then back at Gideon. "Does the well have a rope?" she asked. Gideon blinked. Yes, a rope and a bucket." "Okay," Lily said, and went back to her pebble. Maren looked at him with an expression that might, in a different woman at a different moment, have been a smile. "Wednesday," she said. "Your water finder comes Wednesday. I want to be there when he looks." "Noon," Gideon said. "He won't come before noon." "Noon, then." She adjusted the yoke on her shoulders. "And Mr. Ashcroft." She said it with her back already half to him. "If this is about your wife, if this is something you need to do for her, I understand that. But if at any point this becomes something you need me to be grateful for, I'll ask you to stop." The bluntness of it should have stung. It didn't, quite. He understood what she was asking. "Fair," he said. She walked. Lily picked up her pebble and put it in her pocket and trotted to catch up with her mother, casting one last look at Gideon over her shoulder that seemed to say, simultaneously, "You'll do and we'll see." Gideon walked home feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. Not happy, exactly. Something quieter than happy. The feeling of having said a true thing, out loud, to someone who heard it. Roy arrived Wednesday at 10 past noon, which was early for Roy, and therefore a kind of peace offering, though Gideon understood he was not supposed to acknowledge this. "I was a small man, Roy, shorter than you expected when you first met him, with hands that seemed too large for his frame and eyes that were the particular flat gray of creek water in December. He'd spent 50 years looking at ground and had developed opinions about it that were equal parts geology, intuition, and stubbornness. And he was wrong about it approximately never, which he would tell you himself if you gave him the slightest opening. He got out of his truck, looked at Gideon, looked at the Holloway property spread out behind the fence line, and said, "She know I'm coming? She'll be here at noon." Roy looked at the sky. "It's noon now." "She's a woman who walks 4 miles for water and raises 2 children alone. She'll be on time." Roy made the sound that might be a laugh. "All right." Maren was, in fact, already crossing the far end of the property when they walked down. She'd come from the house. She must have gone out earlier that morning, gotten her water, come home, settled the baby. And she was walking towards them, with Lily at her side and a wariness about her that she wasn't trying to hide. Gideon introduced Roy. Roy looked at her the way he looked at ground, flat-eyed and direct, taking in information. "Your husband dig anywhere on this property?" "He talked about it," Maren said. "Never got to it." "Where'd he talk about?" She pointed toward the northwest corner, near a stand of cottonwood trees. Roy nodded slowly, already moving in that direction. Gideon and Maren followed at a slight distance. Lily trailed Roy with intense focus, as if she'd been assigned to document his movements. What Roy did was not mystical and not entirely explainable, which was the thing about Roy that Gideon had never quite resolved. He walked the ground. He crouched occasionally and pressed his palm flat against the dirt. He looked at the trees, at the way the soil changed color near the root lines. He picked up a handful of earth and crumbled it between his fingers and smelled it, which always looked ridiculous, and which Roy clearly did not care about looking ridiculous doing. He had a forked stick. He used it sometimes, and sometimes he didn't. Today he mostly didn't. He walked for 45 minutes without saying anything useful. Maren watched from a respectful distance, not hovering, but not missing anything either. Once, Roy stopped near a low depression in the ground and stayed there for a long time, and Maren caught Gideon's eye with a look that asked a question without words. Gideon shrugged slightly, which was the only honest answer he had. Finally, Roy came back to where they were standing. He looked at the ground between his boots for a moment, thinking something through. "Northwest corner," he said. "Maybe 60-65 feet down. Could be more. Rock ledge runs across this whole section," he gestured broadly. "But it breaks up near those cottonwoods, water's sitting under the break." Maren said, "How sure are you?" Roy looked at her. "Lady, in 50 years I've missed water on 3 properties. One of those was my fault, and 2 of them I blame on the rock." He said it without particular pride, just as a statement of record. "This isn't one of those." Maren absorbed that, looked at the cottonwoods, looked at the distance from them to her house. Not far, maybe 150 yards. Close enough to run a pipe, if they ever got that far. "When?" she said. Gideon said, "We can start Friday, if you're willing." Maren looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Lily, who was still standing beside Roy with the solemnity of someone attending to important business. "Lily," she said. Come here. Lily came. Marin crouched down to her level and said something quietly, and Lily listened and then nodded once. The same grave nod she'd been giving important information since apparently she was old enough to give nods. Marin stood back up. Friday? She said. Thursday passed the way days pass when you're waiting for something, slowly at first and then in a rush. Gideon confirmed Webb and Curtis, loaded the equipment he had on hand onto the wagon, arranged to borrow a drill head from a man on the other side of the valley who owed him a favor, and tried to remember the last time he'd started something without being certain how it was going to end. He couldn't, quite. He'd been a cautious man for a long time. Claire used to say that he didn't start something unless he could see most of the way to the finish. And she'd meant it as a gentle criticism, and he'd received it the same way, and neither of them had done anything much about it. Well, here was something he couldn't see the finish of. He was starting it anyway. Friday morning arrived with a thin overcast that took some of the ferocity out of the heat, which Gideon chose to receive as a neutral fact rather than a sign of anything. He was not a superstitious man. He loaded the wagon, picked up Webb and Curtis, drove to the Holloway property, and arrived to find Marin already there with the baby on her hip, and Lily sitting on the fence rail, watching the road with the alert focus of someone who had been watching since before it was reasonable to watch. She been up there long? Gideon asked Marin. Since breakfast. Curtis started unloading equipment. Webb walked the northwest corner to get a look at the ground and came back nodding to himself in the private way people do when they're confirming something they already thought. They started digging at 8:30. It was, as all well digging was, mostly unglamorous. The first 10 feet went quickly, loose topsoil, no problems. 15 feet and they hit a clay layer that slowed things down and clogged the drill head twice. Curtis was good with the equipment. He cleared it without making it into a drama. Webb dug alongside by hand where the drill wouldn't reach, working in the quiet, methodical way of a man who has made his peace with hard labor. Marin brought water at mid-morning, not a production, just a bucket and some tin cups, set down near the dig site without ceremony. Gideon said thank you. She nodded and went back to the house to check on the baby. Lily stayed. She had taken up a position approximately 4 feet from the dig site, which was as close as Gideon had been willing to allow, and she watched everything with an attention so complete it was almost unnerving. Once, Curtis glanced over at her and said, "You planning on digging wells when you grow up?" "Maybe," Lily said, as if she were actually considering it. "Good money in it," Curtis said. "Mr. Dempsey said there was water here," Lily said. "Is there?" "We're looking." "How long till you know?" Curtis wiped his forehead. "Could be tomorrow. Could be next week. Could be longer. Ground doesn't operate on a schedule." Lily considered this with visible displeasure. "That's inconvenient," she said. Curtis laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him. Gideon, working the rope on the far side, heard it and looked over. Something about that small exchange, the little girl's precise irritation and Curtis's honest laugh, loosened something in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. By late afternoon, they were at 22 feet, no water. The rock Roy had predicted started showing at around 18, a pale gray limestone that resisted the drill and needed to be worked carefully to avoid cracking in a way that could compromise the shaft. Webb was meticulous about it. He was not a fast worker, but he was a right worker, which in Gideon's experience was worth 10 times the other kind. They stopped at sundown. They were 27 feet down. Roy's estimate had been 60 to 65. They had a ways to go yet. Saturday. Marin came out at 7 in the morning and didn't say anything to anyone, just set a kettle on the small outdoor fire she'd made near the fence line and brewed coffee in the most practical, unsentimental way Gideon had ever seen coffee brewed. She handed cups around, including to Lily, who got hers half full and heavily diluted with water from the morning bucket, and who received this dilution with the dignity of someone who understood the rule and didn't agree with it but would abide by it for now. By noon they were at 38 feet. The rock was giving way to a darker layer which Roy, who had arrived at 11:30 and stationed himself near the dig with the specific kind of stillness that meant he was paying close attention, said was a good sign, or at least not a bad one. At 2 in the afternoon, Silas Rourke appeared at the property line. Gideon saw him first. Silas was 55 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had started out handsome and been made harder by years of getting what he wanted. He was on horseback, which was his habit. Gideon had almost never seen the man on foot, as if the ground itself was something to be elevated above. He sat at the fence line and looked at the dig site and did not say anything for a long minute. Then he said, loud enough to carry, "Ashcroft." Gideon straightened up. He walked over to the fence line slowly, not hurrying, which he knew would irritate Silas and couldn't quite make himself care about. "Silas, what are you doing on this woman's property?" "Digging a well." Silas looked at the site, at the pile of displaced earth, the equipment, Webb and Curtis still working, Roy watching Silas now with his flat gray eyes from across the yard. "You're going to drain the aquifer under my land. Roy Dempsey says the water table here is separate from your spring." Roy Dempsey is 70 years old and finds water with a stick. "He finds water," Gideon said. "The stick is secondary." Silas's jaw tightened. He was a man who did not like being answered calmly when he was being aggressive. Calm responses read to him as dismissal, which they partly were. "I have legal access rights to the spring and the land beneath." "You have access rights to the spring," Gideon said, "not to the land beneath this property. That's Mrs. Holloway's land. If there's water under it, it's her water." Maren had come out of the house. She was standing about 20 feet behind Gideon, the baby on her hip, and she was listening with an expression that was perfectly neutral in the way of someone who has had to learn to be very careful with their face around powerful men. Silas looked at her. "Mrs. Holloway." "Mr. Rourke," she said. Same tone, same neutral care. "You understand that any well on your property could interfere with established water rights on the surrounding land." "Mr. Dempsey believes the water table is independent," Maren said. Her voice was even. "I'm willing to have a county surveyor confirm it if that addresses your concern." That was better than Gideon would have done. He'd have been blunter. Silas looked between them. He was calculating something. Gideon could see it, the way Silas always looked when he was deciding how hard to push. He had a particular narrowing of the eyes that meant he'd found the edge of what direct confrontation would get him, and was looking for a different angle. "This isn't over," he said, which was the kind of thing a man said when he didn't have anything more specific ready. "I expect you're right," Gideon said. Silas looked at Maren one more time. Something moved in his face. Gideon couldn't read it. It was there for less than a second, and then Silas had turned his horse and was riding back the way he'd come, upright in the saddle, not looking back. The dig site was very quiet for a moment. Then Curtis said, from down in the hole, his voice slightly echoing up the shaft, "Was that going to be a problem?" "Might be," Gideon said. "Want me to keep digging?" Gideon looked at Maren. She was looking at the fence line where Silas had been, and her expression had shifted now that he was gone. The neutrality had softened into something more tired and more honest. "Yes," she said, without looking away from the fence line. "Keep digging." Curtis kept digging. Sunday was supposed to be a rest day. Nobody said that out loud, but it was Sunday, and there were conventions. Webb and Curtis weren't there. Gideon came anyway. He wasn't sure exactly what he came for, to check the site, he told himself, to make sure the shaft was secure, to look at the progress. Maren was sitting on the porch steps when he arrived, nursing the baby under a cloth with the practiced discretion of a woman who had learned to manage everything one-handed. Lily was in the yard building something with sticks and rocks that might have been a house or might have been a corral. The design was ambitious either way. Gideon looked at the dig site for a minute. Then he sat down on the bottom porch step, one step below Maren, which was the only seat available if he was going to stay, and he stayed because he found he didn't particularly want to leave. "Silas Rourke moved his fence," Maren said after a while. Gideon looked at her. "When?" "Sometime last night or early this morning. The back fence, the one that cuts off the shortcut to the Tanner Spring." She paused. "It's 2 miles shorter now, for the walk." Gideon thought about that. "Why do you think he did it?" Maren was quiet. She looked at Lily and her building project. "I don't know. Maybe he got scared about the survey. Maybe it was something else." She shifted the baby slightly. "I've never understood Silas Rourke. I've tried. Has he always been hard on you? I was hard on Thomas too. Before Thomas died. He wanted to buy this land, offered twice. Thomas said no both times." She paused. "After Thomas died, Silas came by once. Said the same offer stood if I wanted to sell. I told him I didn't." She said it without particular heat, just reporting. "He put the fence up about a month after that. The fence that added 2 miles to her walk. The fence she'd been walking around for 8 months. Gideon sat with that information and what it felt like, which was not good. Has he ever... He stopped. Has he given you any other trouble? He sent someone to tell me I was using too much water from the spring, she said. I was taking what I needed, no more. She glanced at him. I measured it, just in case. I knew he might try. Of course she had. Of course she'd measured it, quietly, carefully, because she'd known a man like Silas would look for any opening. He's afraid, Gideon said. Maren looked at him. Men like that are always afraid of something, he said. They put up fences and move the water because they're scared of what happens if they don't control everything. It's not strength. It just looks like strength from the outside. He paused. Doesn't make it less harmful, but it's what it is. Maren considered this. Is that what you were, before? The question hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. What do you mean? You said you kept meaning to dig Clara's well. You kept having reasons not to. She was looking at Lily now, not at him. Was that fear or something else? Gideon thought about it honestly. It was an uncomfortable amount of honesty to be doing on a Sunday morning on someone else's porch step, but she'd asked plainly, and she deserved the same. Habit, he said finally. Not fear exactly, just it was easier to keep doing what I'd been doing. The urgency was always somewhere else. I kept thinking there was more time than there was. He paused. I think that's its own kind of cowardice, different from Silas's, but not entirely unrelated. Maren was quiet. I don't think you're like him, she said at last. I want to say that. I know I'm not like him, Gideon said. That doesn't mean I can't learn something from looking at him. Lily came over carrying a rock that seemed important and showed it to her mother. Maren looked at it with appropriate gravity and said it was a very good rock. Lily looked at Gideon, apparently deciding whether the rock was relevant to him. It has a stripe in it, Lily told him, holding it up. It does, Gideon agreed. That usually means it's been somewhere interesting. Lily looked at the rock with renewed respect and went back to her project. Gideon sat on the porch step for another hour. They talked about other things, her land, what she was trying to grow, the problems she'd had with the back 40 where the soil was poor. He knew something about soil. She knew more than he expected, which should not have surprised him and did anyway, a little. At some point, the baby fell asleep and she moved him inside. And when she came back out, she brought 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking if he wanted it, which he appreciated more than seemed reasonable. The coffee was better than his. He did not say this because it seemed like the kind of observation that led somewhere complicated. Monday, she said, when he finally stood to leave. Monday, he agreed. We should be at 50 feet or so by end of day if the rock cooperates. She looked at the dig site and then at the cottonwood trees and then at the long distance to the ridge road where she walked every morning. Mr. Ashcroft, she said. Gideon. She looked at him, said his name once, trying it out like something that fit differently than she'd expected. Gideon. Then, thank you for sitting here today. You didn't have to do that. No, he said. I know. He walked back to his truck and drove home and sat in his kitchen for a while without turning a light on, listening to the quiet that was, tonight, a little less accusatory than usual. Outside, the sky had cleared to a deep, clean blue, and the stars over the valley were the kind of clear that only came after weeks of heat, sharp-edged and numerous, the way they'd looked the first night he and Clara had slept in this house, 37 years ago, when everything was still in front of them and the well was a thing they'd get to eventually. He sat there a long time. Tomorrow, they'd dig deeper. Monday came in hard. The overcast that had softened Saturday was gone, burned off by a sun that arrived mean and stayed that way. By 7 in the morning, the air already had that particular weight to it, the kind that sat on your shoulders and made every movement cost a little more than it should. Webb and Curtis were at the site before Gideon, which told him something about the both of them that he already knew but appreciated being reminded of. They were at 31 feet when he arrived. The Sunday rest had given the shaft walls time to settle, which was good. Loose walls at depth were dangerous in a way that snuck up on you, and Gideon had seen one shaft collapse on a dig 20 years ago and had no desire to see another. Webb had checked the walls before starting Monday morning. He reported them sound. Curtis had the drill head cleaned and ready. They went down. Maren came out at 8 with water and went back in. She was doing that. The quiet provisioning, the presence without hovering. And Gideon was grateful for it in a way he didn't examine too closely. He'd worked on projects before where the property owner stood at his elbow all day asking questions. and it made the work harder in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding ungracious. By 10 o'clock, they were at 40 feet. Roy arrived at 10:30, earlier than his stated policy and without explanation. He sat on an upturned bucket near the shaft and watched the progress with the focused, patient attention of a man who has learned that watching carefully is its own kind of work. He didn't say much. Once, he crouched near the pile of displaced earth from the morning's dig and held a handful of it to his nose and was quiet for a moment. "Still tracking right," he said. "How much further?" Gideon asked. "I can't tell you exactly. Rock formation runs different than I thought on the east side. We may be looking at 70, 75. Gideon did the arithmetic. At their current pace, that was another 3, maybe 4 days. He looked at the sky and thought about the heat and thought about Marin walking the ridge road at dawn this morning with her buckets and her baby and Lily dragging her stick along the fence rail. "Then 75 it is," he said. Roy made a sound that might be a laugh. "Boom." The first thing that went wrong was the drill head. They were at 46 feet when it happened, a grinding sound from below, different from the normal resistance of rock against metal, and then a lurch, and then Curtis saying something short and emphatic that Gideon was glad Lily wasn't close enough to hear. The head had caught on a crack in the limestone at an angle and twisted, and when they brought it back up, the lead edge was bent in a way that made it useless. Curtis climbed out of the shaft and looked at the bent metal and said, "I can fix this." "How long?" Gideon said. "Tonight. I'd need to get it to the shop in town," which meant half a day lost, minimum. Gideon looked at Webb. "I can keep at it by hand," Webb said, meaning he would dig with the long-handled tools while Curtis was gone, which was slower by a factor of about 4, but was better than standing still. "I've worked rock before." "Do it," Gideon said. Curtis loaded the drill head onto his truck and drove to town. Webb went back into the shaft. The sound from below changed to the slower, more deliberate rhythm of hand tools on limestone, and Gideon stood at the edge and listened to it and thought about the things that go wrong that you can't anticipate and can only absorb. Roy said, from his bucket, "This is why I charge what I charge." "You find the water," Gideon said. "You don't dig it." "No, but I put my reputation on whether it's there," Roy said. "Every time we lose a day, that's another day for something to go wrong that makes me look bad, even though it's not my fault." "Your reputation is fine, Roy." "My reputation is exceptional. I'd like to keep it that way." Gideon sat down on the ground next to Roy's bucket, and they were both quiet for a while, listening to Webb work below. "You doing this because of Clara?" Roy said. Roy was one of the 3 or 4 people in Gideon's life who had known both him and Clara well enough to say her name without it being a performance. I was doing it now matter-of-factly, the way Roy did most things. "Partly," Gideon said. "And the other part?" Gideon thought about it. He thought about Marin at the fence line, not slowing, about the water pouring through the rails over Silas's calf, about Lily on the fence rail at 7 in the morning, watching the road for a truck she'd been told might come. "She deserves water," he said. "She's been carrying it long enough." Roy was quiet. "Simple as that?" he said. "Simple as that." Roy looked at the shaft opening and then at the cottonwood trees and then at the Holloway house in the distance. "Clara would have liked her," he said. Gideon said nothing. "I'm just saying," Roy said. "I heard you," Gideon said. Roy stood up and stretched in the particular way of old men with bad backs, with a care for each movement that looked almost choreographed. "Going to be a long week," he said. "Yes. I'll come back tomorrow." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Roy picked up his hat from the bucket and put it on. "I'll come back tomorrow." He left without saying goodbye, same as always, and Gideon watched him go and felt something that he supposed was friendship, though it was such an old and battered version of the thing that it was sometimes hard to recognize. Curtis came back at 4 in the afternoon with the drill head repaired and a piece of news from town that he delivered in the casual way of someone who doesn't know if it's important and is leaving that determination to the listener. "Heard at the shop that Silas Rourke's been talking to people," Curtis said, threading the repaired head back into position, "telling folks the well's going to drain the spring, that the whole South Valley will lose its water source." Webb looked up from where he was cleaning the shaft walls. Gideon said, "Who's he talking to?" "Couple of the bigger landholders. Pete Vance, the Kimball brothers. And I don't know if this matters. He sent someone to the county recorder's office in Ridgecroft. Something about water rights documentation. Gideon thought about this. How recent? Yesterday sounds like Sunday. So the day after Silas had come to the property line and been turned away, he'd moved to a different strategy. He'd gone to find paperwork. It was, Gideon had to admit, a smarter move than direct confrontation. The water table here is independent, he said. It was what he'd told Silas on Saturday and what Roy had confirmed. But confirmation and documentation were different things, and Silas knew that better than most. Roy's certain? Curtis said. Roy's certain. Whether that's enough against a lawyer and a county deed is a different question. They worked until sundown. The drill head, repaired, went faster than Webb's hand tools, and they gained 8 more feet before the light failed, 54 feet down, heading into a section of rock that Roy had said would be the last hard layer before the ground changed character. Tomorrow, maybe. Or the day after. Gideon did not let himself think about Roy's revised number. 75 feet. 21 more feet of hard ground, maybe, and then water. Maybe. He drove home and ate something he didn't taste and went to bed earlier than usual and lay awake longer than he wanted. Tuesday brought a visitor he hadn't expected. He was at the site by 7:30. Webb and Curtis were already there. Roy had not arrived yet. Marin was in the house. The morning was clear and brutal again, the heat arriving early like a guest who doesn't wait to be invited in. At 8:30, a wagon came down the road from the north. Gideon watched it from the dig site, not particularly alarmed. Wagons came and went on this road, until it turned onto the Holloway property, and he recognized the woman driving it, Pearl Kimball. 47 years old, wife of James Kimball, who ran the largest dry goods operation in Millhaven and owned the property that ran along Marin's north fence line. Pearl was the kind of woman who did not make small gestures. When she brought food, she brought enough for 8 people. When she had an opinion, she had the whole opinion and all of its supporting arguments. She pulled up near the house and got down before anyone could help her, which was consistent, and unloaded a covered pot and a cloth-wrapped package from the wagon bed, and carried them to the front door of the house with the business-like focus of someone delivering a contract. Marin came to the door. Gideon could hear their voices, but not the words. There was a brief exchange, Marin's body language shifting from surprise to something careful. And then Pearl put the things down on the porch step and said something that made Marin straighten. Then Pearl walked across the yard to where Gideon was standing. "Pearl," he said. "Gideon." She looked at the shaft, at the displaced earth, at Webb's head just visible below the surface. "My husband says Silas Rourke is telling people this well is going to ruin the spring. Roy Dempsey says the water tables are independent. James believes Roy Dempsey. Silas believes whoever tells him what he wants to hear." She looked at Gideon steadily. "I came to tell you that James and I are behind this. If Silas tries to make legal trouble, he should know he doesn't have the county on his side." Gideon was surprised enough that he didn't immediately answer. Pearl noticed this and seemed slightly impatient with it. "She's been walking 4 miles a day with those children," Pearl said. "Anyone who drives that road has seen it. It's just that most people are better than Silas at making their conscience quiet." She said it with the flat precision of someone who has thought this through and arrived at a verdict she's comfortable with. "I've brought food for the week. She'll try to say no." "She might," Gideon said. "You should know she already said yes," Pearl said, with a small definite look that suggested she had handled Marin Holloway's pride with a sophistication that Gideon had not managed on his first attempt. "I told her I wasn't bringing charity. I was bringing lunch for the men working on her land, because men who dig in this heat need to eat, and it was purely practical and had nothing to do with pity." She paused. "Which is mostly true." Gideon looked at her. "That was well handled." "I know," Pearl said, and walked back to her wagon and drove away. Webb had come up from the shaft during this exchange and was listening with the particular non-expression of a man who is hearing things and making no comment. When Pearl's wagon was out of sight, he said, "Nice to have allies." "It is," Gideon said. "Silas is going to come back." "I know." "What are you going to do when he does?" Gideon looked at the shaft, at the 54 feet of hard-won depth, at the cottonwood trees where Roy had said the water was, at the Holloway house where, right now, Marin Holloway was probably standing at her door, looking at a pot of food that Pearl Kimball had called practical and feeling something complicated about it. "Keep digging," he said. Roy arrived at 11. He went straight to the shaft without greeting anyone and looked at the latest displaced earth for a long time. Then he said, Different. The rock? Gideon said. What's coming up now? Roy crouched and pressed a handful between his fingers. Texture's changing. We're getting close to the break. The break was what Roy had identified. The fracture in the limestone beneath which, he believed, the water was sitting. Waiting, as Gideon had come to think of it, which was a sentimental way of thinking about geology, and which he allowed himself only in private. How close? Curtis said. Roy straightened. Could be the next 10 feet. Could be 15. He looked at the shaft and then at Gideon. Could be more. I don't say this to be difficult. I say it because the ground doesn't always perform the way it looked like it was going to from the surface. We keep going, Gideon said. I know we keep going, Roy said, with a patience that suggested he had not needed to be told this. I'm managing your expectations. My expectations are fine. Your expectations are optimistic. That's different. But Roy said it without heat, and when Curtis went back down, Roy took his usual seat on the bucket and watched, and Gideon understood that Roy's presence was its own form of commitment. He drove out from his property, which was not close, every day that he hadn't been explicitly invited to come. He sat on a bucket in the heat and watched other people dig. He offered information when he had it, and silence when he didn't. It was what Roy had instead of easy warmth, and Gideon had learned, over the 22 years of their difficult friendship, to recognize it for what it was. Tuesday evening at 5:15, when the light had started going golden long and the heat had finally pulled back enough to feel like something had been negotiated rather than surrendered, Maren brought out the food Pearl Kimball had left. She set it up at the folding table she'd moved out from the house, a thing that took some effort to move, and which Gideon had offered to help carry, and which she had declined and managed on her own, because that, he was learning, was how she handled things where she could. And she ladled out the food without commentary, and they all ate. It was good food. Pearl had made a beef stew that had been simmering long enough to be serious, and there was cornbread, and something sweet, for after that Lily consumed with a focus that suggested it had been on her mind since she'd smelled it from the porch. They ate in the particular quiet of people who have been working hard together and have run out of things to say that need to be said, and the quiet was comfortable, which was its own thing. It wasn't always, with people you'd only known a week. Roy said, without preamble, into the middle of this quiet. First well I ever found water on, I was 22. Man's name was Aldrich, had a small property, family of 6. He'd been hauling water from a creek 2 miles north for 8 years. Nobody said anything. Roy didn't usually volunteer stories. Dug for 11 days, Roy said. Found water on the 12th. Aldrich's youngest daughter was about, he looked at Lily, about your size. When the water came up, she cupped her hands and drank right from the bucket. Didn't wash her hands first, didn't ask anybody, just drank. Lily looked at Roy with the focused interest of someone receiving important information. I've been thinking about her hands ever since, Roy said. 50 years. Every well I've found, I think about her hands. Maren looked at Roy for a moment. Then she looked at Lily. Lily looked at the shaft opening, currently still just dark earth and no water, and then looked back at Roy. I'll wash my hands first, she said. Roy made the sound. This time it was definitely a laugh. Us. Wednesday morning, Silas Rourke came back. Not alone this time. Gideon saw the 2 men on horseback coming down the road from the east and recognized Silas immediately. The second man took a moment. A broad man, maybe 35, wearing clothes that were better than most people in this county wore on a workday. Not a rancher, not a laborer, a lawyer. Gideon had lived long enough to know a lawyer by his boots. They came to the fence line and Silas called out, Ashcroft. Gideon set down what he was doing and walked over. Behind him, he heard the sounds of work slow and then stop, which meant Webb and Curtis were listening. Silas, he said. The man with Silas said, I'm Howard Price. I represent Mr. Rourke's interests in a water rights claim he is filing with Ridgecroft County. I've been asked to inform you that any further excavation on this property may be subject to injunction pending the outcome of that claim. Gideon looked at him, then at Silas. Is that so? The documentation of Mr. Rourke's established water rights predates the Holloway deed by 11 years, Price said. He had the smooth, flat voice of a man who had said many things in many rooms and had learned that tone was a weapon. Any well on the adjacent property that draws from the same water table would be in direct conflict. Roy Dempsey's professional assessment is that the water tables are independent, Gideon said. Mr. Dempsey is not a licensed hydrologist. No, He's better than a licensed hydrologist. He's Roy Dempsey. Gideon said it without sarcasm, just a statement of fact. And I will note that Silas Rourke was not concerned about water rights when he was giving Pete Vance's family free access to the spring for 10 years, which I believe he did between 1891 and 1901, before Pete sold his property and Silas decided generosity wasn't worth the trouble. Price's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He hadn't known about Pete Vance. Silas had, probably. Silas's jaw had tightened. "This isn't personal," Price began. "It's always personal," Gideon said. That's my experience with water disputes." Marin had come out of the house. She walked to the fence line and stood beside Gideon. Not behind him, not in front of him, beside. And she looked at Silas directly. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I know you want this land." Silas said nothing. "I know that's what this has been about," Marin said. "Since Thomas died, you thought I'd have to sell. You thought the water would be the thing that made me." She said it without trembling, without heat, just clearly and quietly, the way she said most things. "I'm not selling, not this year and not the next one." "Mrs. Holloway," Price began. "I'm talking to Mr. Rourke," Marin said. Price stopped. Silas looked at her. His face was doing something complicated that Gideon couldn't entirely read. There was irritation in it, and something else underneath the irritation. He opened his mouth, and then he didn't say what he'd been going to say, and what came out instead was, "That was my mother's spring." Nobody expected that. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. "I know," Marin said after a moment. She said it quietly. Not softly. Just quietly. Which was a different thing. Silas looked at her for another second, and then at Gideon, and then down at his horse's neck. "File the paperwork, Howard," he said. He turned and rode east without looking back. Price spent a moment reorienting, like a man whose speech had been interrupted mid-sentence and was trying to find his place. And then he said something about receiving formal notice, and turned and followed Silas. Gideon and Marin stood at the fence line and watched them go. "That was his mother's spring," Marin said, half to herself. Not a question. "Edna Rourke," Gideon said. "She homesteaded the property herself, before Silas was born. She died when Silas was about 15. He paused. "She was known for being generous with the water." Marin was very quiet. "I didn't know that," she said. "Most people don't anymore." Gideon watched the dust of the two departing horses settle back onto the road. "Silas doesn't talk about her, but he named the spring. I don't know if you knew that. On his property records, he calls it Edna's Spring." Marin turned and looked at the dig site, at the shaft opening, at Lily, who was watching the road where the men had gone with her serious judge's face. "Keep digging," she said. It was the second time she'd said those words. Both times there had been the same quality in her voice. Not defiance exactly, but something near it. The decision to continue made not in the absence of opposition, but directly in front of it. Gideon went back to the shaft. The legal notice arrived Thursday morning. A county deputy brought it out. A young man who had the look of someone performing a task he found personally embarrassing, which Gideon appreciated as a sign of character, and handed it to Gideon because Marin had seen the wagon coming and gone back inside for reasons that turned out to be irrelevant to the notice, but which Gideon understood. He read it. Then he drove to Ridgecroft with it in the afternoon, leaving Webb and Curtis working, and he sat in the office of a man named Samuel Holt, who was the county's most reliable attorney and who had, among other useful qualities, handled Gideon's own property matters for 15 years. Holt read the filing. He read it again. He made a sound that meant he was being careful about his expression. "What?" Gideon said. "It's not frivolous," Holt said. "The Rourke water rights are documented, and they are senior. If Price can demonstrate that the well draws from the same table as the spring, Roy Dempsey says it doesn't. Roy Dempsey's word is good in this county. Whether it's good enough in a legal filing is a different question." Holt set the paper down. "You need a hydrologist, licensed, someone who can produce documentation that counters the claim with the same level of technical authority. How long does that take? To find one and get them out here? Best case, 3 weeks. More likely a month." "The well could be done in 3 days," Gideon said. "Then finish it before the injunction is formally served," Holt said. He said it carefully, looking at his desk rather than at Gideon. "I am not advising you to do anything improper. I am pointing out that there is a difference between a filed claim and an active injunction, and that the clock on the ladder starts at service of notice. Gideon looked at him. 3 days, he said. Give or take, Holt said. I would aim for 2. Gideon drove back to the Holloway property. It was late afternoon. Webb and Curtis had reached 59 feet. He told them what Holt had said. Not all of it, just the relevant part. 2 days, Curtis said, if we can manage it. Webb looked at the shaft. We'd need to run nights. Gideon said, I know. A night dig was not unusual, but it was harder. Lantern work at depth was tricky, and the risk of not seeing something important in the walls went up in low light. Webb and Curtis were experienced enough that the risk was manageable. Manageable was not the same as absent. I'll stay nights, Webb said. Curtis can trade off. I'll do the same, Gideon said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, Gideon said, and Webb gave him a long look and then nodded. Maren came out while they were talking. She heard the end of it, not all of it, but enough. What happened? She said. Gideon told her. He told her plainly, without softening it, because she was a woman who received information better than she received comfort, and he had figured that out by now. He told her about the legal filing, about the hydrologist, about the timeline. She stood with her arms folded across her chest and listened without interrupting. The baby was asleep inside. Lily was somewhere in the backyard. The sun was going down, and the light was that deep amber color that made everything look more beautiful and more sad than it probably was. And if you don't finish before the injunction, she said, we stop. Wait for the hydrologist. Fight it legally. He paused. We'd win eventually. Roy's assessment is solid, and Holt thinks the claim has weaknesses. But it would take months. Months. She looked at the ridge road already in shadow. Okay, she said. Okay? Do what you need to do. I'll bring food out tonight, and I'll take a turn on the rope if you need it. Gideon looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, with a slight edge that might have been exasperation or might have been something more like affection. He couldn't entirely tell and wasn't going to push on it. Thursday night. Lanterns at the shaft. Moths finding the light and circling it with the specific meaningless devotion of moths. The sound of tools on rock drifting up from below, steady and slow. The rhythm of it becoming something you stopped hearing after a while the way you stopped hearing your own heartbeat. Gideon worked the rope when Curtis was below. Webb went down at midnight, and Curtis came up and lay on his back in the dirt and closed his eyes without a word and was asleep in under a minute. Maren brought coffee at 10 and again at 2. She did not make conversation, which was the right call. Conversation at that hour and in that kind of work was an irritant, not a comfort. She poured the coffee and set the pot where they could reach it and went back inside, and that was exactly what was needed. At 3 in the morning, Roy showed up. No explanation. He just drove up in his truck, got out, walked to the shaft, looked down at Webb working below, and then sat on his bucket. Roy, Gideon said. Heard about the filing in town, Roy said. Couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning. I'm 70. I don't sleep at 3 in the morning regardless. He settled onto the bucket. How deep? Webb was at 64 when he went down. Roy was quiet. He looked at the lantern light moving below, the slow rise and fall of displaced earth coming up the rope. We'll find it, Roy said. Gideon looked at him. How sure? Roy looked back. Sure enough to be here at 3 in the morning. They didn't talk after that for a long time. At around 4, Lily appeared in the doorway of the house in her nightgown, barefoot, watching from the porch with enormous eyes. Maren materialized behind her almost immediately and bent down and said something, and Lily said something back, and Maren looked at the dig site for a moment, and then Gideon was surprised by this. She let Lily stay, brought a blanket out and wrapped it around her and sat with her on the porch steps in the dark, and Lily watched the lantern light from below with the intense, serious focus she brought to everything she decided was worth watching. At 20 past 4 in the morning, Webb called up from below. His voice had a different quality than usual. Not loud, not alarmed, but changed. Boss, he said. Gideon went to the shaft edge. What? Bring the lantern closer. Gideon moved the nearest lantern. In the shaft below, Webb was crouching at the bottom, one hand on the wall, looking at something in the rock face in front of him. Touch the wall here, Webb said, right at the base. Gideon couldn't reach. The shaft was 65 feet down. Tell me what you feel. A pause. Wet, Webb said. Roy stood up from his bucket. Wet like seepage, Gideon said. Or wet like something moving behind it, Webb said. Slow, but moving. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Roy said quietly, "There it is." Gideon straightened up. He looked at the porch where Marin was sitting with Lily wrapped in the blanket. They were both looking at him. Even at this distance, in the dark, he could see that Lily had sat up straight. He looked at Roy. Roy nodded once, the nod of a man who has been right 50 years in a row and is not surprised to be right again, but allows himself in the small hours of a Thursday night to feel the specific warmth of it. "We keep going," Gideon said. Webb went back to work. Geek. Friday dawned with the same brutal intention as every day that week, the heat arriving without courtesy or delay. Gideon had not slept. He was aware of this the way you're aware of a low-grade pain, present, noted, not going to stop him from anything. Curtis came back at 6, having slept a few hours in his truck, and took over from Webb at the shaft. Webb came up and sat with his back against the fence and was asleep in that position, sitting up, before anyone had said anything to him, which was a skill Gideon had always respected. They were at 68 feet. Roy said the break was close. Maybe 10 feet. Maybe 5. He couldn't be more precise than that, and he didn't pretend to be, which was one of the things Gideon respected about him. Roy knew the edges of his own knowledge and didn't dress them up. At 7:30, Pearl Kimball's wagon came down the road again. And behind it, after a few minutes, another wagon, James Kimball on it, and 2 men Gideon recognized as Kimball ranch hands. James pulled up at the fence line and got down and walked over without particular ceremony. "We heard you're running nights," James said. "We are." "You need more hands?" Gideon looked at the shaft, at Curtis below, at Webb asleep against the fence, at Roy on his bucket with his arms folded and his hat over his eyes, resting in the particular way of a man who is not actually sleeping, but is not going to be useful in the immediate term either. "I could use 2 more people on the rope rotation," Gideon said. James nodded to his hands, who began unloading things from the wagon bed. Not just themselves, but equipment, lanterns, food. Pearl had packed for an army, which seemed to be Pearl's standard approach to any situation she took seriously. Marin came out of the house and saw the wagons and stopped at the edge of the porch. She looked at Pearl, who was directing the unpacking with the organizational precision of someone who has done this before. "Pearl," Marin said. "Don't," Pearl said pleasantly, but with the kind of finality that didn't leave room for debate. Marin was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Pearl said. "Now come help me figure out where to put this food." Marin came down off the porch and went to help Pearl, and Gideon watched her go and felt he wasn't going to overcomplicate this. He felt something about the straightness of her back and the way she walked toward the help instead of away from it. This time, not easily, not without some internal cost that he could see in the set of her shoulders, but she was doing it. She was letting people be here. That cost something. He knew how much it cost. He'd spent years not letting anyone be anywhere near him after Clara died, and he'd paid for that too, in a different coin. He turned back to the shaft. "Let's finish this," he said to nobody in particular. The sun climbed. The work continued. The earth beneath Marin Holloway's property had been holding its water for longer than anyone could say, and 68 feet below the surface, in the dark, behind a limestone wall that was beginning to show the first fine cracks of yielding, it was starting to run out of reasons to keep holding on. Webb woke up at 9 and went back down without being asked. They were going to need every hour between now and when that notice arrived. And somewhere in the far county seat, a deputy was probably getting on his horse. By 9 in the morning, the Holloway property had more people on it than it had probably seen since the Tanners built the original structure 30 years back. James Kimball's 2 hands had taken over the rope rotation, giving Webb a longer rest than the hour he'd managed against the fence. Curtis was below at depth, steady and methodical, working the rock face where the seepage had appeared the night before. Roy had emerged from his resting posture and was crouched at the shaft edge, watching the material coming up with the focused attention of a man reading a text only he could decipher. Pearl had organized the food situation with the efficiency of a military quartermaster and had also somehow produced a folding table from somewhere in her wagon that none of them had noticed before. Gideon stood at the shaft edge and drank coffee, and tried not to do the math on the hours remaining before the county deputy arrived with the formal injunction notice. Holt had said 2 to 3 days. That estimate had been given Thursday morning. It was now Friday, which meant today or tomorrow, which meant the margin was gone, and what was left was just the work and the time and whatever the ground decided to do. Webb came back at 9:30, looked at the shaft, looked at Gideon, and said, "How close does Roy think?" "He stopped saying specific numbers," Gideon said. "That good or bad?" "With Roy, it means he's focused." Webb considered this and went to check the shaft wall integrity, which he did every few hours without being asked, running his hand along the casing where they'd set it, checking for any shift or seep that might indicate instability. It was the kind of careful that wasn't dramatic, but was the whole reason Gideon had wanted Webb on this job. At 10 o'clock, Dottie Vance arrived. Gideon heard the wagon before he saw it and looked up to find her driving herself, which was not unusual for Dottie, who had strong opinions about what she needed assistance with, and driving was not on that list. She pulled up and got down and looked at the assembled people and the equipment and the shaft opening and said, "Well, it got serious." "It's been serious," Gideon said. "It got visibly serious," Dottie said, which was different, and she was right. She had a crate in the wagon bed, and she took it herself when Gideon moved toward it. "I've got pie, and I've got bread, and I've got the story you should probably know about before Silas Rourke gets here." Gideon looked at her. "He's coming?" "Word in town is he's coming," Dottie said, setting the crate on Pearl's commandeered table. "When exactly, I can't tell you, but someone told him there were Kimball wagons out here, and he didn't take it calmly." She began unpacking the crate. "James Kimball is the third largest landowner in this county. Silas doesn't like not being on the right side of James Kimball." "What's the story?" Gideon said. Dottie stopped unpacking. She looked at him with the expression she got when she was about to say something that mattered and was deciding how to arrange it. "Edna Rourke," she said. The name landed the same way it had when Silas said it at the fence line 2 days ago, with a weight that didn't match its sound. "Tell me," Gideon said. Dottie leaned against the table. "Edna Rourke homesteaded that property alone. You knew that part. What most people don't know, or don't remember because it was a long time ago, is that she did it with almost nothing. Her husband died crossing the mountains before they ever got here. She arrived with 2 children, Silas and a younger girl named Ruth, and about $40 and some livestock and whatever she could carry." Dottie paused. "She found the spring herself, dug the first channel herself. She watered her animals and she watered her neighbors, and she never once put up a fence around it." Gideon said nothing. "Ruth died when she was 9, Dottie said. Fever. After that, it was just Silas and Edna. When Edna died, Silas was 15, like you said, and within 2 years he had his first fence up around the spring." She looked at the shaft. "I'm not saying I understand it. I'm saying I know what it is. He lost her, and then he locked up the one thing she'd been most free with." She picked up the unpacking again. "Whether that helps you or not when he shows up, I don't know. I just thought you should have it." Gideon stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "Does Marin know?" "About Edna? I don't know what she knows." He went to find Marin. Bess. She was in the house, feeding the baby, when Gideon knocked on the open door frame. She looked up, and he came in and stood in the kitchen. It was a small kitchen, everything in it placed with the precise economy of someone who had learned to make less space work harder. And he told her what Dottie had told him. Marin listened without moving. The baby made small sounds. Outside, the noise of the dig continued. The rope, the displaced earth, Roy's occasional low instruction. "His mother built the spring," she said when Gideon finished. "Yes." "And then she died, and then he fenced it." "Yes." She looked down at the baby, not at Gideon. Her face was doing something careful and internal that he'd seen before on her and had learned not to rush. "He wasn't trying to hurt me," she said at last. "He was trying to hold on to something." "He still put the fence up," Gideon said. It came out more blunt than he'd intended. "I know," Marin said. "Both things are true." She shifted the baby and looked up. "It doesn't change what he did. I just want to understand it if I can." Gideon looked at her for a moment. He thought about the thing Roy had said Sunday, about Clara. He thought about how much easier it was to be angry at Silas than to do what Marin was doing right now, which was trying to see around the edges of a man who had made her life harder for 8 months. "You're a more patient woman than I am a patient man," he said. "I have children," she said. You learn patience, or you lose your mind. But there was something in her voice when she said it. Not quite humor, but its shadow. The place where humor used to live before the last 8 months had made even that more careful. She stood and settled the baby in the crib in the corner and then turned and said, "If Silas comes today, I want to be the one to talk to him." Marin, not because I trust him, she said, because I understand something about him now that I didn't before, and I want to use it. She said it without cruelty, just with the practical directness of someone who had been surviving on her own long enough to know what tools she had and how to use them. "Will you let me?" Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He thought about how many ways this could go wrong, and he thought about the calf, about the water she'd poured through the fence rails, about because it was thirsty, and he thought that a woman who had done that without hesitation probably understood something about Silas Rourke that he didn't. "Yes," he said. It was just past 11 when Silas came. This time he didn't have Price with him. He came alone, which was either significant or tactical, and Gideon couldn't yet tell which. He came on the same chestnut horse, the same elevation above the ground, the same set to his jaw that was either arrogance or armor, and from 50 feet away it was still hard to know for certain. There were more people at the fence line than the last time he'd been here. James Kimball had noticed him coming and moved casually but deliberately to stand near Gideon. Roy had looked up from the shaft and stayed where he was, which was close enough to make a point. Pearl had stopped what she was doing, Dottie too. Silas took all of this in without visibly reacting. He looked at Gideon and said, "The injunction will be served today." "Then we'd better keep digging," Gideon said. "That won't change anything. The county—" "Mr. Rourke." Marin had come out of the house. She walked across the yard with the same walk she had on the ridge road. Not hurried, not hesitant. The walk of someone who has made a private agreement with the distance between 2 points and intends to honor it. She came to the fence line and she looked up at Silas on his horse and she said, "Will you get down, please?" Silas looked at her. The request had surprised him. Gideon could see it, a small rearrangement in his face, something recalibrating. He got down. He did it without saying anything, looped his reins over the fence post, and stood on the other side of the fence, looking at Marin with an expression that was still guarded but was no longer the same as before. "I know about your mother," Marin said. Silence. "Dottie Vance told me," she said, "about how she homesteaded the property, about the spring." She paused. "About Ruth." Silas's face closed down. The guarded thing hardened into something more deliberate. "That's not relevant to—" "I think it is," Marin said. Not aggressively, quietly, the way she said most things. "I think maybe it's the only relevant thing." Silas said nothing. "My husband is buried on this property," Marin said, "in the northwest corner near the cottonwood trees." She turned and looked toward that direction, and then looked back at Silas. "They're going to dig a well near those trees. Roy Dempsey believes the water is there." She paused. "I was afraid of that for a while. That they'd be too close, that it would feel wrong." She said it plainly, as if this was information she had decided he should have. "But Thomas would have dug that well himself if he'd had more time. And I think he would have wanted it there, near him. So the water would be near everything we were building." Silas was very still. "Your mother built the spring," Marin said. "She gave water to everyone who needed it. That's what I hear. That's who she was." She kept looking at him steadily. "I don't think she'd have wanted a fence around it." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that costs something to produce, that comes from a very specific kind of impact that words occasionally have when they're aimed precisely right and they land. Silas looked at the spring, not at Marin, not at Gideon, but somewhere to the east where the spring was, on the other side of his own fence line. "You don't know what she'd have wanted," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. Not mean, just rough. "No," Marin agreed. "I don't. I'm telling you what I think based on what I've heard." She paused. "You knew her. You know better than I do." Silas was silent for a long time. One of the things Gideon noticed, standing there, was that nobody else was talking. Not James Kimball, not Pearl, not Dottie. The whole yard had gone quiet in the particular way that happened when a conversation reached a place that everyone recognized as serious, and the watching became the most important thing anyone present could do. Then, from across the yard, there was a sound. Not from the shaft. From behind Gideon and to his right, near the fence line where Silas's horse was tied. The horse had shifted, and in shifting had lifted one front leg slightly and set it down with a motion that wasn't right, a careful, favoring set, the kind that meant something was causing pain. Silas noticed it at the same moment Gideon did. His attention went to the horse immediately, the way it does with a man who cares about his animals, even when he's in the middle of something else. "Easy," Silas said to the horse. He moved around the fence to the animal's left side, crouching to look at the raised hoof. Marin had already moved. She went to the other side of the horse, the right side, the favoring leg, and crouched down and picked up the hoof with both hands before Silas had processed what she was doing. "Stone," she said, "deep in the frog. I can manage," Silas started. "I need something to dig it out," she said, not to Silas, looking around. Lily, who had materialized from somewhere during the confrontation and was standing near the fence post, immediately produced a small penknife from her pocket with the air of someone who has been waiting to be useful. Gideon blinked. "Where did she get that?" he said to no one. "She found it in the yard last week," Curtis said from somewhere behind him. "I told her to keep it." Marin took the knife from Lily without comment and went back to the hoof. She worked carefully and steadily, the horse shifting once and then stilling as Marin spoke to it quietly. Not words, just sounds, the specific low frequency of someone who has dealt with animals in discomfort and knows how to make themselves known as safe. The stone came out after about 45 seconds. Marin held it up briefly. A sharp piece of quartz, the size of her thumbnail, and then set the hoof down gently. The horse put its weight on the leg, tested it, shifted, settled. Silas was crouching on his side of the horse, watching. When Marin stood up, he stood up too. They were on opposite sides of the animal. "He'll be sore for a day," Marin said, "but it's out clean, no abscess." Silas looked at the horse, then at Marin, then at the stone she was still holding. His face was doing the complicated thing again. The thing Gideon had first seen at the fence line on Saturday, that second before he'd said, "File the paperwork, Howard." "You've done that before," Silas said. "Thomas kept horses," Marin said. "I learned." Silas was quiet. He reached out and put his hand on the horse's neck, a gesture so automatic and unguarded that it was almost jarring. The difference between the man he'd been performing for the past week and the one who simply, without thought, reached for an animal he cared about. "This is the same horse," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "What?" Marin said. Silas looked at her. "The calf you watered last Sunday, from your bucket." He said it like he was placing something that had been sitting wrong in him. "It was this horse's calf. My foreman told me. The calf from the east pasture. A woman had stopped and watered it through the fence." He paused. "He didn't know it was you." Marin said nothing. "You poured your water through my fence," Silas said, "for a calf you'd never seen before, on land you had no reason to care about." "It was thirsty," Marin said. It was exactly what she'd told Lily. Exact same words, same tone. As if there was no other explanation needed and she wasn't going to manufacture a more complicated one for his benefit. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at the shaft. At Roy, who was watching him from the shaft edge with flat gray eyes. At Webb and Curtis and James Kimball's hands. At Pearl and Dottie and the folding table. At Lily, still standing near the fence post with the solemn intensity of someone attending to something that matters. He looked at all of it. "What are you going to do if you find water?" he said. It was directed at Marin, not Gideon. "Water my garden," she said. "Water the orchard I want to plant along the south fence. Give my children a glass of water in the kitchen without planning a 4-mile walk first." Silas absorbed that. "The orchard," he said. "What kind?" Marin looked slightly wrong-footed by the question. "Apricots, maybe. Thomas thought apricots would do well in this soil." She paused. "And apples, if I can get the variety right." Silas was quiet for a moment longer, and then something happened in his face that Gideon had not seen there before. Not kindness exactly, not guilt exactly, but a yielding. The specific giving way of a man who has been holding something rigid for a very long time and has just, in the space of about 5 minutes, lost the structural reasons for holding it. He said, "My mother grew apricots." Nobody said anything. "On the east slope behind the main house," Silas said. "She said the soil there was right for it." He looked at Marin's land, the stretch of it visible from where they stood, the south fence she'd mentioned, the slope behind the house. "Your south slope has the same exposure." Marin didn't say anything. She was watching him with the careful attention she brought to things she hadn't decided about yet. "I'll withdraw the filing," Silas said. The yard absorbed this in silence. Gideon heard Curtis, down in the shaft, stop working. Whether he'd heard or simply sensed the change in the atmosphere above him, Gideon couldn't have said. "I'll call Price this afternoon," Silas said. "Tell him to withdraw." He reached for his horse's reins. He looked at Marin one more time. "The fence that blocked your shortcut. I had it moved last week." "I know," Marin said. "I noticed. I should have done that sooner." "Yes," Marin said, simply. Not forgiving him and not condemning him, just confirming a fact. "You should have." Silas nodded once. He mounted his horse, carefully, checking the animal's movement before putting full weight in the saddle, and looked out toward the east. "Edna's spring," he said, half to himself. "My mother called it the valley's water. Not her water, just the valley's." He looked at Marin. "I think she would have been ashamed of the fence." "Maybe," Marin said, "but you can decide what to do with it." Silas rode east. He didn't look back this time either, but it was a different kind of not looking back than before. Less like retreat, and more like someone going somewhere with intention. The yard was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then Pearl said, "Well," and went back to the table, which was as much of a comment as Pearl's economy of expression allowed. James Kimball looked at Gideon. "That went better than I thought." "She did it," Gideon said. He wasn't talking about the stone in the horse's hoof. James looked toward where Marin was standing, still near the fence post, watching the direction Silas had gone with an expression that was harder to read than relief. "She did," he said quietly. Dottie had come to stand near Marin. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was what Marin needed, and Dottie knew it. Roy called from the shaft edge. "Can we get back to it?" Everyone got back to it. They were at 71 feet by 2 in the afternoon. The seepage from the night before had become something more consistent. Not a flow, not yet, but a definite presence. A cold damp against the shaft walls that Curtis described when he came up as feeling like the rock was exhaling. Roy had heard this and said it was a reasonable way to put it, which from Roy was approximately a standing ovation. Gideon had not let himself feel it yet. He'd been in this position before on other people's wells, on the close side of something, with the thing itself just out of reach, and he knew that the final feet were the ones that had the most capacity to disappoint. The ground could do things right up to the last moment that changed everything. But he could feel it in the people around him. The quality of the attention had shifted in the way it shifted when something was getting near the end. Lily had been at the shaft edge for the last hour, despite 3 separate attempts by Marin to bring her inside for lunch. Each time she had gone in, eaten something standing up, and come back. Marin had stopped trying after the third one and had simply brought the food outside, which was a tactical adaptation Gideon recognized as the decision of someone who knew when she'd lost. At 2:30, the county deputy arrived. I was the same young man who'd brought the notice on Thursday, the one with the look of someone performing a task he found personally embarrassing. He came down the road on horseback, spotted the collection of people in wagons, and slowed to a walk as if reassessing whether he'd been adequately prepared for whatever this was. Gideon walked out to meet him before he reached the fence line. "Ashcroft?" the deputy said. "That's me." "I've got a formal notice of injunction from Silas Rourke's attorney, Howard Price," Gideon said. The deputy blinked. "Yes, sir." "You should know that Mr. Rourke contacted Mr. Price this afternoon to withdraw the filing." The deputy looked at the notice in his hand, then at Gideon, then at the assembled people behind Gideon. I don't have any record of a withdrawal." "It would have been placed within the last hour," Gideon said. "I can't control the administrative timing. You're welcome to confirm it with the county recorder's office." The deputy looked at the notice again with the expression of a young man who had been given a straightforward task and had arrived to find it tangled up in things he didn't have procedures for. "I'm supposed to serve this." "Then serve it," Gideon said, "and we'll respond to it through counsel once the withdrawal is processed." He paused. "But you might call ahead before you ride all the way back out, if you end up being asked to bring anything else." The deputy served the notice, because he was correct that it was his job, regardless of subsequent developments, and Gideon took it and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. The deputy rode back down the road, looking somewhat less certain of the world than when he'd arrived. James Kimball said, "Do you actually believe Rourke called Price?" "Yes," Gideon said. "Based on what?" "Based on watching him look at that horse after Marin took the stone out." James considered this. "That's not a lot." "No," Gideon said, "but it's enough." He went back to the shaft. 3 o'clock, 73 feet. Webb was below. He'd been working steady since 2, rotating with one of Kimball's hands on the rope. The material coming up was different now. Roy had been looking at every load with increasing attention, the flat gray eyes moving over it, the way they moved over everything he was serious about. At 3:15, Roy said, "Stop the drill." Curtis, who was operating from above, stopped. "Bring Webb up," Roy said. Gideon looked at him. "Why?" Roy looked back. "Because if I'm right about the timing, I don't want someone down there when it breaks." The yard went very still. Webb came up the rope hand over hand. He was strong, Webb. Even after 2 days of hard work and incomplete sleep, he came up with the reliable strength of a man whose body had been asked to do hard things long enough that hard things had become its normal state. He came over the edge and stood up and looked at Roy. "How close?" Webb said. "Very," Roy said. They all stood back from the shaft opening. Roy crouched at the edge and lowered a lantern on a rope and held it there and looked for a long time. Then he pulled the lantern back up. 6 inches, he said, maybe 8. There's a fracture running horizontal at the base of the south wall. The pressure behind it has been building all day. He looked at Gideon. "When it goes, it'll go fast." "What do we do?" Marin said. She'd come up beside Gideon without him hearing her approach. Lily was at her side. The baby was inside. Gideon registered this without looking, just from the quality of the quiet around her. "We let it go," Roy said. "Then we case the base of the shaft once the flow stabilizes. Then we fit the pump head." He looked at the shaft, and then at the sky, and then at the shaft again. "Won't be today." "Tomorrow?" Marin said. "If it goes in the next hour, maybe," Roy said. "If it goes tonight, tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "It'll go." "You're sure?" she said. Roy looked at her with the flat gray eyes that didn't perform certainty, but contained it in the way cold water contains cold. Not as a quality it demonstrated, but as a thing it simply was. "I'm sure," he said. Marin nodded. Once. Then she looked at Lily. "Come inside," she said. "But, Lily." Lily looked at the shaft. She looked at Roy. Roy looked back at her with the same flat attention he gave everything. And then he said, with an evenness that was somehow more comforting than reassurance would have been, "You'll hear it from inside." Lily went inside with her mother. The afternoon stretched. Webb and Curtis secured the shaft casing as far down as they safely could, preparing for what was coming. Roy sat on his bucket. James Kimball and his hands stayed, not because there was specific work for them, but because the kind of people who stayed through the hard part of something also tend to stay for the end of it. Dottie made coffee. At 4:30, Pearl said, "I need to get home before dark," and hugged Marin at the door of the house and said something in her ear that Gideon couldn't hear, and Marin's eyes went somewhere complicated for just a moment before she straightened and said she understood. Pearl took her folding table back to her wagon. It was Pearl's table, she wasn't leaving it, and drove north. At 5 o'clock, with the sun beginning its long slide toward the hills, and the heat, finally, reluctantly, starting to relent, Silas Rourke appeared on the road again. He was on foot this time. His property wasn't far by horse, but he'd come on foot, which was a thing Gideon noted without knowing exactly what to make of it. He was also not alone. There was a man with him that Gideon didn't recognize, older, with the look of someone who worked with his hands and had been doing it a long time. Silas stopped at the fence line. He looked at Gideon and then at the shaft. "I called Price," he said. "The withdrawal will be filed first thing tomorrow." Gideon nodded. He'd believed it before. He believed it now. "This is my foreman, Aldian," Silas said. The older man beside him nodded. "He used to dig wells before he came to work for me." Silas paused. He looked at the shaft, at the people around it. "I thought, if you needed another hand for the casing work, we'd be grateful," Gideon said, before Silas could find a reason to take it back. Silas looked at him. Something moved in his face. Relief, maybe, or the closest thing to it that a man like Silas allowed himself in front of other people. "Aldian knows what he's doing," he said. "He worked wells in 3 counties before he came to me." "I'll take him," Gideon said. Silas handed Aldian over the fence line, figuratively speaking, with a look between them that said something in private about expectations and pride that Gideon was not going to examine. Aldian went to introduce himself to Webb in the way craftsmen introduce themselves to each other, not with much talking, but with a look at the shaft and a specific question about the casing diameter. Silas stayed at the fence line. Marin had come to the door of the house. She saw Silas and came out onto the porch, but not down the steps, and they looked at each other across the yard. "The filing is withdrawn," Silas said. "Thank you," Marin said. Silas looked at the cottonwood trees, at the shaft. He put his hands in his pockets, which was the most at a loss Gideon had ever seen him look. "There's something else," he said. He was still looking at the trees, not at Marin. "I had a pipeline survey done 2 years ago, the whole South Valley. I had ideas about irrigation back then, before I decided against it." He paused. "The survey would tell you how to run a line from your well to the house. The grade, the materials, all of it. It's just paper, but it would save you from having to pay someone to figure it out again." He looked at Marin now. "I'll send it over," he said. Marin was quiet for a moment. "That's generous, Mr. Rourke." "It's paper," he said. "It's just sitting in my office." Gideon looked at Marin. She was watching Silas with the careful expression she brought to things she hadn't decided about, and then something in it settled. "My daughter's name is Lily," she said. "She's 5. She's the one who's been watching this whole operation like it was her personal responsibility." Silas looked faintly confused by this information. "She's going to want to know who found the water," Marin said. "I'll tell her Roy Dempsey found it, but she's also going to want to know who helped us get it." She paused. "I'd like to be able to tell her the truth about that." Silas looked at the house. Through the window, visible if you knew to look, Lily's face was pressed to the glass with the total commitment of a 5-year-old who has been told to stay inside and is doing so as literally as possible while remaining as close to the outside as the instruction permits. Something crossed Silas's face that might have been the specific pain of a man who has spent many years being someone he is not entirely comfortable being, and who has just been offered, by a woman whose shortcut he blocked, and whose walk he extended by 2 miles, and whose spring he fenced, a version of himself that is different from that. He looked away from the window. "Tell her the whole valley helped," he said. "That'd be closer to true." He turned and walked back the way he'd come, on foot, in the direction of his own land, where Edna's spring sat behind the fence he'd now moved once, and was, Gideon suspected, beginning to reconsider entirely. The sun was getting low. The shaft sat open and ready in the northwest corner of the Holloway property, near the cottonwood trees where Thomas Holloway was buried in the quiet ground. At 6:47 in the evening, they heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. A sound like a seam giving way. A low, pressured release, and then a different quality of silence from below. And then Roy, who had been crouching at the shaft edge with his eyes closed in the attitude of a man listening to something only he could quite hear, opened his eyes and looked at Gideon with an expression that contained 50 years of being right about this. "There it is," Roy said. Webb went to the edge and dropped the lantern on its rope, and they all looked down into the yellow light that showed them the base of the shaft changed. The south wall fractured and open, and in the lantern's reach, the dark gleam of movement. Water. Cold and certain and utterly indifferent to all the human difficulty that had surrounded its arrival, it was simply there, the way it had always been there, below everything, waiting to be asked for properly. Marin came out of the house. She had been inside, she'd heard it, just as Roy had told Lily she would. And she came out quickly, but not running, the baby on her hip, and she stopped at the edge of the group of people standing around the shaft and looked at Gideon. He looked back. I didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. She could see it in his face, and in Roy's, and in the way Aldian and Webb and Curtis and James Kimball's hands were all standing in the particular posture of people who have just finished something real. Lily exploded out of the house behind her mother. She ran past Marin, past Gideon, past everyone, and went directly to the shaft edge where Webb caught her by the back of her collar before she got too close. And she looked down into the lantern light at the dark gleam below and said, with the total clarity of a 5-year-old seeing exactly what she'd been waiting to see, "It's there." "It's there," Webb agreed. "Is it cold?" "Should be." Lily considered this with immense satisfaction. Then she looked at Roy across the shaft opening. Roy was watching her with the flat gray eyes that had watched 50 years of this particular moment and had never, apparently, gotten tired of it. Did you know? Lily asked him. Yes, Roy said. The whole time? Most of it, Roy said, which was the most honest version of the answer. Lily accepted this. She looked back down into the shaft at the water that was not yet close enough to reach, and would not be, tonight or probably tomorrow, while the casing work was done and the pump head was fitted and all the practical necessary things were attended to. The water was there but not yet available, which was its own particular kind of moment. The thing found, the work not yet done. She understood this, apparently, because she straightened up and looked at her mother and said, "When can I drink it?" Marin looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Webb, who looked at Aldean, who had already turned back to the casing equipment with the practical attention of a man who knew what tomorrow was going to require. Day after tomorrow, Gideon said, if everything goes right. Lily nodded, with the gravity of someone accepting a timeline they don't love but recognize is out of their hands. Marin was looking at the shaft, not at the people, not at Gideon, just at the opening in the ground near the cottonwood trees where the water had finally decided to come up after all this time. Her face was doing something that was private enough that Gideon looked away from it, not because it was painful to see, but because it belonged to her, whatever it was. And he didn't need to see every part of it to understand it. The light was going gold and long, the particular late-day light that made the valley look like something that had been painted rather than grown, and they all stood around the shaft in it, tired and dirty, and some of them still faintly disbelieving, the way you are when something you worked hard for actually arrives. Dottie, somewhere behind Gideon, said quietly, "Well, it took long enough." Nobody argued with that. The casing work took all of Saturday. Aldean ran IT. I was a quiet man, Silas's foreman, the kind of quiet that came from decades of work rather than from having nothing to say, and he moved around the shaft with a familiarity that told you immediately he'd done this enough times that his hands knew what to do before his mind finished the instruction. Webb deferred to him without ego, which told Gideon something good about both of them. Curtis assisted and learned and didn't pretend to know more than he did, which was its own kind of competence. Gideon mostly stayed out of the way. He had the useful self-awareness to know that this part of the work was not his part. He had organized the thing and paid for the thing and had the conversation that made the thing possible, and now the thing required people who knew how to case a well shaft at 73 feet, and he was not one of those people. He found work to do at the edges. He hauled. He held rope. He fetched what was asked for and stayed quiet when quiet was what the work needed. Roy sat on his bucket and watched everything with the professional attention of a man inspecting his own legacy. By noon, the lower casing was set. By mid-afternoon, the pump mechanism was positioned at the head of the shaft, and Aldean was working through the connections with the care of someone who understood that the difference between a working well and a problem was often the quality of attention given to the last few steps rather than the first many. Marin brought lunch out at 12:30. Not a production. Bread and meat and 2 kinds of pickled things she'd put up herself, and coffee. She set it out on the ground near the shaft, because Pearl's folding table had gone home with Pearl, and nobody said anything about this because nobody was in a position to find anything wrong with it. At one point, Aldean looked up from the pump mechanism and said to nobody in particular, "Good shaft, straight down, walls solid. Whoever dug this did it right." Webb said from across the shaft, "That'd be Curtis mostly." Curtis said, "Webb did the hard rock." Aldean said, and went back to the pump. It was, Gideon thought, approximately as much recognition as any of them needed or expected. Lily had understood since the night before that the water was there, but not yet reachable, and she had accepted this with a patience that Gideon suspected was costing her considerably. She spent Saturday oscillating between the shaft area, where she maintained her observer's position at the regulation distance, and the northwest corner of the property near the cottonwood trees, which she visited several times throughout the day for reasons she didn't explain, and which Marin didn't ask her to. In the late afternoon, Gideon found her standing at the cottonwood trees by herself. Not at the grave marker. She was a few feet from it, looking at the shaft that was visible from here, watching Aldean and Webb at work from this distance. Gideon stopped beside her. They stood together for a moment. "Does your mama come here often?" he said. "In the morning sometimes," Lily said, "before the walk." Gideon looked at the simple marker, Thomas Holloway, the dates, nothing else on it because there hadn't been money for more, and Marin wasn't the kind of woman who would have asked for charity to put words on a stone. It was plain wood, but it was solid and straight, and someone had made it with care. Did you know him? Gideon said. Your father. I was 4, Lily said. I remember some things. She looked at the marker and then at the shaft. He said he was going to dig a well. He showed me where. He said right here, near the trees, so the water would be cold. Gideon stood very still. He picked this spot, Gideon said. He said it was the right place, Lily said. He knew about ground. She said it with the complete confidence of a child who has not yet learned to qualify the things her father told her. He said the water's always there. You just have to ask it the right way. Gideon looked at the cottonwood trees and at the shaft between them and at the marker a few feet away. Roy was right. They were all right. The water was there. It had been there the whole time. He didn't say anything to Lily about this. It didn't seem to need saying. Well, at 4:17 on Saturday afternoon, Aldian stood up from the pump mechanism, stretched his back with the careful deliberateness of a man managing years of protest from the same joints, and said, All right, let's try it. The yard gathered without being told to. Gideon, Webb, Curtis, Roy, James Kimball's hands, who had come back again that morning. Dottie, who had arrived at noon ostensibly to bring food, but had stayed 6 hours past the food being consumed. Marin with the baby on her hip. Lily at the front, because Lily was always at the front. The pump was a simple hand mechanism. The same design Gideon had on his own property, reliable and unromantic, a long handle and a cylinder and a spout that curved over a wooden catch basin they'd set beneath it. Nothing beautiful about it. It would work or it wouldn't. Aldian put his hand on the handle and looked at Marin. You should do it, he said. Marin looked at him, then at the pump, then at Lily, who looked back at her with the expression of someone who would very much like to be consulted on this allocation of duties. Lily, Marin said. Lily went to the pump. She put both hands on the handle, which was almost as tall as she was. She looked at Aldian. Up and down, she said. Up and down, he said. She pulled the handle up, pushed it down, up again. The mechanism engaged with a sound that was neither encouraging nor discouraging, just the sound of metal finding its movement. Down again. Up. The rhythm settled into something that fit her small frame without her having to work too hard at it. For a moment, nothing came. Roy, from 3 feet away, made no sound. Then there was a sound from the spout. Not water yet. Air first, the pressured exhale of a mechanism clearing itself. And then, mixed with the air, something darker and colder. And then water. Not a flood. Not a gush. A steady, clear, cold column of it, falling into the wooden basin with a sound that was so ordinary and so enormous at the same time that several of the people watching it had no good response available to them and simply stood there absorbing it. Lily stopped pumping and looked at the water in the basin. She reached both hands in up to the wrists and held them there, and then pulled them out and looked at the water on her hands, and then looked at Gideon. It's cold, she said. Good cold or bad cold, Gideon said. Lily gave him the look. There's no bad cold for water, she said. Roy made the sound that was a laugh. This time there was nothing ambiguous about it. Lily cupped her hands and drank. She didn't wash her hands first. Roy looked at this with an expression that nobody present could entirely read, but which Gideon, standing close enough, thought contained something that was 50 years old and particular and private, and he did not look at it directly. Marin stepped to the pump. She put her hand on the handle and pumped it twice and let the water run over her other hand, and then she cupped it and brought it to her mouth and drank. She straightened up. She did not cry. Gideon had been half expecting something along those lines. It would have been understandable, warranted, nobody would have thought less of her. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was that she straightened up and looked at the pump and at the basin of cold water and at the cottonwood trees and at the marker between them, and her face was simply present, fully present, in a way that faces were not always. Then she looked at Gideon. Thank you, she said. He said, Thomas picked the right spot. She looked at him for a moment and then looked at the trees, and whatever moved across her face then was hers, and he didn't try to name it. The pipeline took 3 more days. Silas's survey was exactly what he'd said it was, thorough and practical, with the grade calculations and material specifications laid out in the clean hand of an engineer who had known what he was doing. Aldian ran that work too, with Webb and Curtis and one of Silas's own ranch hands, whom Silas sent over Monday morning without preamble or explanation, a young man named Ford, who was strong and willing and very quiet, and who worked alongside Webb with the easy compatibility of two people who don't need to talk to coordinate. They trenched from the pump head to the house. It was not glamorous work. Trench digging rarely is, and it was made harder by a section of the yard near the old chicken run where the ground turned rocky about 18 inches down and had to be broken up before the trench could continue. It added half a day. Nobody complained. On Wednesday morning, they ran the pipe. By Wednesday afternoon, Maren had water at her kitchen pump. She tested it with a cup. Cold and clear, and with the particular taste that well water has. Mineral, specific, like a place rather than a neutral thing. She stood at the kitchen pump and drank a cup of water that she had not walked 4 miles to get. And she stood there for a moment after she drank it with the empty cup in her hand. Then she put the cup down and went outside to check on the baby, who had developed a small cough that she was monitoring with the focused concern of a mother who has learned that small things need watching. Life continued. That was the thing about life. It didn't pause at its own significant moments. You had your cup of water, and then you went back to the things that needed doing, because there were always things that needed doing, and the water hadn't changed that. It had just changed how much of you was left over for them. What happened in the weeks after was not dramatic. It was instead the kind of slow accumulation of change that doesn't announce itself because it's made up of small adjustments rather than large ones. Maren's garden, which had been surviving on carefully rationed water carried 2 miles, began to receive what it had been asking for all along. The difference was visible within a week. Not miraculous, not overnight, but definite. The kitchen garden thickened. The squash that had been barely holding on came back with the particular vigor of plants that had been conserving. She ordered the apricot stock in late September. 6 trees, which was what the south slope had room for if she spaced them right, and 2 apple varieties that Thomas had mentioned once as being suited to this elevation, and which she had looked up in a seed catalog at the Millhaven General Store, cross-checking his memory against the printed word with the methodical care she brought to everything that mattered. She planted them herself, on a Saturday, while Lily held the measuring string between stakes to get the spacing right, and the baby sat in the dirt nearby in the contained, absorbed way of babies who have not yet developed opinions about dirt. Gideon came to help, because he had done this before, and knew that apricot stock needed a particular preparation of the planting hole that wasn't intuitive if you hadn't seen it done. Maren accepted the help without extensive discussion, which was progress. She was learning, or allowing herself to receive what was offered without converting it first into debt. It was not easy for her. He could see it wasn't easy. But she was doing it. They worked through the morning. At noon, she made lunch and they ate on the porch steps. Her on the top step, him on the lower one. Lily running some private operational errand in the backyard that involved a lot of serious back and forth movement and no explanation. And they talked about the orchard and about the soil and about what Thomas had known about growing things in this specific valley. And at some point, the conversation became not about Thomas or about orchards, but just about 2 people talking, and neither of them made a point of noticing it. Silas came to the property once more in October. He came in the morning, on foot again, which Gideon had come to understand was his way of coming without the elevation, without the chestnut horse, and the height that put him above other people. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of equal ground that Silas was probably capable of, and Gideon had decided some weeks ago that you had to meet a man where he actually was, rather than where you thought he should be. Maren met him at the fence line. Gideon was there too, not by design but because he'd been working on a section of fence near the cottonwoods that morning and had simply not left yet. Silas had a roll of paper under his arm. He handed it over the fence to Maren. "Updated survey," he said. "I had the engineer out again last week. The aquifer under your property is fully documented now, independent of the spring. Separate table, separate feed source." He said it flatly, without drama. "If anyone challenges the well in future, that document is your answer." Maren took it. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke." Silas looked at the cottonwood trees. At the pump head visible from here, the plain metal of it already beginning to weather into the landscape the way things did when they had been given time. "The fence," he said. "Which fence?" Maren said. "The one around the spring, my mother's fence." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm taking it down." Gideon looked at him. "The whole thing," Silas said. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. It was never meant to be there." She'd have said so. He said it without the roughness that had been in his voice when he'd mentioned his mother before. Whatever that roughness had been covering, he'd done some work on it, or time had, or both. I'm going to open the access back to the old path. Anyone who needs water from the spring can have it. Marin said, That's a generous thing. It's the right thing, Silas said. They're not always the same, but in this case they are. He looked at the orchard, the 6 young apricot trees planted in their measured spacing along the south slope, small and committed looking in the October light. Not yet anything close to what they were going to be. They'll take a few years, he said. I know, Marin said. My mother's trees were 15 years old before they really produced. He said it as information, not discouragement. But they produced every year after that until they were 40. Marin looked at the trees. 40 years, she said. 43, the oldest one, Silas said. It's still on the east slope. Still gives fruit. A pause opened up, and in it something unspoken moved between them that was not forgiveness exactly, and not friendship exactly, but was something that existed in the space between two people who had been adversaries and have come, not without cost, to something more livable than that. Would you like to see the well? Marin said. Silas looked slightly surprised by the offer. I don't want to intrude. You've been here before, she said simply. Come and see what your foreman built. Silas came over the fence, and Marin walked him to the northwest corner where the pump stood between the cottonwood trees, and Gideon walked behind them at a distance that was respectful of the specific nature of what this was. Silas looked at the pump, at the basin beneath the spout, at Thomas Holloway's marker a few feet away among the roots of the trees. Good placement, he said. My husband chose it, Marin said. Silas nodded slowly, looking at the marker. Something moved across his face that was private and that he didn't try to explain, and Marin didn't ask him to. He pumped the handle once. The water came up cold and clear and fell into the basin with its ordinary, enormous sound. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stepped back and looked at the trees above him, the cottonwoods in their October yellow, and beyond them at the valley laid out to the south and west, the spread of it in the flat autumn light. My mother said this was the best valley in California, he said. She said she knew it the first day she saw it. Was she right? Marin said. Silas looked at the valley for a moment. Yes, he said. She was right about most things. He stayed another 20 minutes. He drank a cup of water from the well. Marin offered it, and he took it without the performance of reluctance that a man doing something symbolic might have made of it, which was its own kind of progress. He talked briefly with Gideon about the south pasture drainage, which was a practical matter that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with two men who were finding, tentatively, the surface of a relationship that might eventually become something ordinary enough to be relied on. When he left, he went over the fence and turned once to look back at the property. The pump, the trees, the house, the young orchard on the slope. And he stood there for a moment in the road with his hands in his pockets before he turned and walked back toward his own land. Gideon stood at the fence line and watched him go. Do you trust him? Gideon said to Marin, who was standing beside him. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. She didn't give him the answer that would have been easier to give. Not completely, she said, but more than I did. She watched until Silas was out of sight around the bend. I think he's trying. I think trying matters, even when it doesn't fix everything. It doesn't fix what he cost you, Gideon said. No, she said. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life accounting for it either. She looked at the orchard, at the pump, at the house she was going to live in for as long as she could manage. I have other things to do. Roy came out one last time in November, not to work. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky had gone the pewter gray that meant winter was arriving at a considered rather than abrupt pace, and he drove up in his truck and got out and stood at the pump for a while without touching it, just looking at it the way a man looks at something he made that has outlasted the making of it. Gideon was there. He'd been there a lot, in October and November. Not every day, but regularly, in the way of a man who has found somewhere worth being and is no longer manufacturing excuses to be there. Roy looked at the pump and then at Gideon and said, I've been thinking about that girl. Lily? Aldrich's daughter, the one I told you about. He put his hands in his pockets. 50 years. I think about her hands every time I find water. He looked at the pump. Now I'm going to think about 2 sets of hands. Gideon said, How's that feel? Roy considered the question seriously. Better, he said. Having 2 is better than 1. Gives it, I don't know, weight. They stood at the pump in the November gray. Inside the house, Marin was doing something that produced a sound of activity, dishes, or cooking, the ordinary sound of a house being inhabited. Lily was at school in Mill Haven, 4 days a week now that the water situation had freed up Marin's mornings enough to make the logistics possible. The baby, who had been given the name Daniel and who had recently developed the ability to pull himself upright against furniture and gaze at the world from this new elevation with an expression of philosophical satisfaction, was presumably inside somewhere at his work. "You ever going to tell her?" Roy said. "Tell her what?" Gideon said. Roy gave him the flat gray look that meant he was not going to dignify the question with a response. Gideon looked at the house. "It's only been a few months." "It's been a few months since the well," Roy said. "You've been thinking about her since August." "I'm not sure that's your business, Roy." "It's not," Roy said agreeably. "I'm saying it anyway because you won't say it to yourself." Gideon was quiet for a moment. There was something true in what Roy was saying that he'd been managing carefully, in the way he managed things that mattered, with attention and patience and the awareness that getting it wrong was worse than going slow. Marin was 8 months into her widowhood when they'd met. She was 14 months into it now. She was not a woman who needed someone to fix her life or complete it or rescue her from it. She was, as she had been from the first morning he'd seen her on the Ridge Road, entirely capable of her own life. That was not the problem. The problem was he wanted to be in it, and that was a different kind of thing that required a different kind of care. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "I didn't say you didn't," Roy said. "I said you're not saying it to yourself. You're carrying it around like a project to be managed." He looked at Gideon with the same directness he looked at ground. "She's not a project. I know that." "Then stop managing it." Gideon looked at the house, at the pump, at the 6 young apricot trees on the south slope, which had made it through their first weeks in the ground and were by all appearances intending to continue. "I'll figure it out," he said. "Figure it out faster," Roy said, and got in his truck and drove home without saying goodbye. He said it in December, not grandly, not with preparation, the way true things sometimes got said, without the architecture you'd been building for them, just plainly, at an ordinary moment. He was helping her repair a section of fence on the north boundary. It was a cold Saturday, one of the first genuinely cold days they'd had, and the work was the kind that required enough concentration to leave room for the other kind of thinking to happen underneath it. She was holding the wire while he worked the staple, and after a moment she said, "You've been out here a lot." "I have," he said. "I'm not complaining," she said. "I'm just noting it." "I know you're not complaining." He set the staple and tested the wire. "I want to keep being out here. I want more than that, actually." He straightened up and looked at her. "I don't want to make this complicated. I know your life is full of things it doesn't need more of." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what you think you'd be? Something that complicates things?" He considered it honestly. "Probably sometimes. I'm not an easy man. I know that." "I don't need easy," she said. "Thomas wasn't easy either." She paused. "He was worth the work." Gideon stood with the fence tool in his hand and the cold air on his face and looked at Marin Holloway in the flat December light. She was looking back at him with the full attention she gave to things she'd decided were worth deciding about. "I'm asking," he said. "That's all I'm doing right now, asking." She held his gaze for a moment. "Ask Lily," she said. He blinked. What?" "She's the one who gave you her pocket knife," Marin said, and the thing in her voice that was not quite humor had gotten considerably closer to it. "She has opinions. You should consult her." Gideon said, "Marin." She looked at him, and the almost humor settled into something more direct. "Yes," she said. "To what you're asking, yes." He nodded. He didn't make more of it than it was, which she would have found exhausting, and she would have found the exhaustion of it instructive in the wrong direction. He just nodded, and they went back to the fence, and the wire was cold in their hands, and the work was real, and the day was ordinary, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. The following spring was the kind that made the valley look like it was making an argument. The Holloway place. People had started calling it the Holloway Ashcroft place by April, which Marin accepted with the practical grace of someone who had bigger things to track, had water running to the kitchen, to the garden, to the stock trough. Gideon had built along the south fence in February. The kitchen garden went in March, twice the size of the previous years. The apricot trees, all 6 of them, leafed out in April with the definite intention of trees that had made up their minds about their location. Lily turned 6 in March. Gideon gave her a proper pocket knife, folding, with a handle that fit her hand, which she received with the gravity of someone being invested with responsibility. They take seriously. Marin gave him a look that was not quite exasperation and was quite a lot of the other thing. The baby, Daniel, learned to walk in April and immediately went for the pump handle, which had been his goal since November, and which he achieved with the expression of a man completing a long campaign. The water that came out surprised him every time, which did not diminish his enthusiasm for trying it again. Silas Rourke removed the fence around the spring in early March. He did it on a Saturday with Aldean and 2 ranch hands. And it took one morning, and by afternoon the old path to the spring was open again for the first time in years. He didn't announce it. He didn't send word. Dottie Vance heard about it from the hardware man who'd sold him the fence removal tools, and she told Pearl Kimball, and Pearl told Marin, and by the following Tuesday half the valley knew. Several people used the shortcut that first week out of what seemed like principle. Gideon was one of them. He rode past Edna's spring on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the water moving in its channel and thought about an old woman who had found this spring herself and called it the valley's water, who had been right about that, who had understood something about what water was for that her son had needed most of his life to learn, and had learned it, finally, in stages, at the fence line of a woman with 2 children and 2 buckets and more backbone than any 10 men Gideon could name. I didn't stay long. He rode home. Roy Dempsey died in June, not suddenly. He'd had a heart that had been giving him private trouble since the previous winter, which he had not mentioned to anyone because it was his heart and his business, and he did not believe in burdening people with information they could do nothing about. He died on a Tuesday morning at his property, which was how he would have wanted it if he'd been the kind of man to specify preferences about such things, which he was not. Gideon heard about it from Pete Duggan and drove out to Roy's place and sat in his truck for a while before going in to see what needed doing. There was a younger cousin who handled the arrangements, a decent man named Hector, who had none of Roy's qualities and was clearly aware of this and was doing his best. At the funeral, a small one, Roy had outlived most of his friends and had not acquired new ones easily. Gideon sat next to Marin and held her hand and thought about Roy sitting on a bucket by the shaft in the pre-dawn dark, saying, I'm sure with the flat certainty of a man who had earned the right to it over 50 years. He thought about the girl with the unwashed hands drinking from a bucket in 1874. He thought about Lily at the pump. The 2 sets of hands Roy had said gave it weight. He thought that the thing about Roy was not that he found water. Lots of people found water. The thing about Roy was that he came back. He came at 3 in the morning on a Thursday night when he couldn't sleep. He drove out every day when nobody had asked him to. He sat on a bucket in the heat and watched people dig and offered information when he had it and silence when he didn't. That was the thing, not the gift, but the showing up. After the funeral, Gideon told Marin this. They were driving back in his truck, Lily in the back with Daniel on her lap, both of them asleep against each other with the total commitment children brought to sleeping in moving vehicles. Marin listened. Then she said, he reminded me of Thomas in that way. Thomas was always showing up to things, even when it cost him. What did it cost him? Gideon said. Time, she said. He never had enough of it, and he gave it away freely, and I used to think that was a flaw. She looked out the window at the valley going past. I understand it better now. Gideon drove and thought about time and what you did with it, and what you let pass, and what you didn't. I want to put a sign up, he said. Marin looked at him. By the well. Something for Lily to read when she's older. He paused. Something for anyone who passes. What would it say? She said. He thought about it. About the ridge road and the buckets, and the morning he'd stood on the fence rail and lost his whole prepared speech. About the calf and the water poured through the fence rails and because it was thirsty. About Silas and his mother's spring and the 43-year-old apricot tree on the east slope. About Clara and the walk she'd made 20 years without saying a word about it. About Roy at 3 in the morning with his bucket and his certainty. No thirst belongs to only one person, he said. Marin was quiet. Is that too much? He said. No, she said. That's exactly right. He made the sign himself, over a weekend in July. Cedar plank, carved letters, the kind of work that required patience and a steady hand, and accepting that it was not going to be perfect and doing it anyway. Lily supervised and had opinions about the spacing of the letters, some of which were correct. Daniel stood at his knee and tried to eat the wood shavings, which was not helpful, but was consistent with his general approach to the world. They put it up on a Sunday morning, on the post beside the pump, where the valley road went past close enough that anyone traveling it could read it without stopping if they wanted to. Maren read it once it was up. She stood in front of it for a moment and didn't say anything, which was the kind of response that meant more than most words would have. Lily read it aloud, carefully, because she was still learning to read fast and preferred accuracy to speed. And no thirst belongs to only one person. She looked at Gideon. "Did you write that?" "I thought of it," he said. "Your mother said it was right." Lily looked at the sign and then at the pump and then at the road going past in both directions. The valley spread out around them in the July light. The apricot trees on the slope, taller now, committed to their ground. The kitchen garden full and dense behind the house. The spring a mile to the east with its fence removed. Daniel sitting in the dirt at their feet, regarding a beetle, with the focused wonder of a boy for whom the world is still mostly made of firsts. "Will people read it?" Lily said. "Some of them," Gideon said. "Will they understand it?" Gideon looked at Maren. She looked at him. "The ones who need to," he said. Lily considered this verdict and seemed to find it acceptable. She went to the pump and worked the handle and drank from her cupped hands and wiped them on her skirt and went back to whatever she'd been doing before, with the complete ease of a child for whom cold, clean water at the farm had already become so ordinary that she didn't think about it anymore, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. That was the whole point of it. That was what it had always been about. Not the drama of the getting, but the ordinary of the having. The cup of water in the kitchen. The garden in the morning. The children drinking without thinking about where it came from, because where it came from was right there, right here, 20 feet from the door, as close as a pump handle. Gideon stood next to Maren beside the sign in the July light and thought about all the things that had to happen for this ordinary moment to exist. About Clara, who had made the walk without complaint. About Thomas, who had chosen the right spot but run out of time. About Roy, who had pressed his hand to the ground and listened. About Silas, who had fenced a spring and taken decades to unfence it and was making slowly with difficulty the long return to who his mother had been. About a morning in August, when he'd stood on a fence rail with cold coffee and watched a woman on the ridge road and felt something give way inside him that he hadn't known was still standing. You couldn't plan what mattered. You could only stay awake enough to see it when it came. He had not been awake with Clara. He had been busy and cautious and full of reasons, and the time had run out before he'd looked up. He was looking up now. The valley was still here. The water was here. The sign was up, and the trees were growing, and inside the house there was a 6-year-old girl learning to read fast and a 14-month-old boy learning to walk without falling, and Maren Holloway was standing beside him in the summer light, with her shoulder 3 inches from his and the whole long life of this place in front of them. He had not arrived here gracefully. None of them had. They had arrived the way people actually arrived at things that mattered, through difficulty and stubbornness, and some luck, and more than a few mistakes, and the willingness to try one more time after the first time didn't work. That was the only secret. There was no other one. You showed up, you stayed, you pumped the handle and let the water come. And if you were paying attention, and if you were lucky, and if you had somewhere along the road learned the difference between a door that is locked and a door that is only being held shut, then the water was there. It had always been there. You just had to ask it right.